Chapter 180. If I scare you to death, where can I find a successor? The problem is that it doesn't sound true. Why not? Chang and city, God-stunning array, to me. Why? Why? Because there are too few divine talisman masters qualified to preside over the God-stunning array, and even fewer who can be absolutely trusted by the empire. Among the 3 divine talisman masters living in seclusion in the academy, only little Huang He is a citizen of Tang, and your uncle Gongsun has a serious health problem. Ning Ke, you are a student of the headmaster of academy and my disciple. Why can't the imperial court trust you? Why can't it be given to you? Who can agree? I agree. Master, is it enough for you to agree? His Majesty has agreed. He told me that he once told you that he would take you to see something after you officially step into talisman Taoism. His Majesty did say that, but, what does it have to do with what we are talking about now? When you see that thing in the future, you will understand. It was certainly a very happy and glorious thing to be a noble divine talisman master. However, if the safety of the whole Chang and city or even the whole Tang Empire was in your hands after becoming a divine talisman master, then this happiness and glory would be countless times stronger. However, the strengthening of glory would eventually turn into a mountain-like responsibility and a sky-like pressure. Thinking that decades later, when he stood on the tower in Chang and looked down at the world, he would no longer be able to feel relaxed and carefree. Instead, he would have to carefully observe the millions of Tang people living among them and be ready to make choices that ordinary people would never be able to make for the survival of the Tang Empire, which had lasted for thousands of years. Ning Ke felt that it was difficult for him to breathe and he felt depressed. If an objective evaluation was made, any young man who had just touched the cultivation world for less than a year and was still in the no-doubt state would be scared to death when he suddenly learned that the big shots of the empire were so important to him in the future. Ning Ke was no exception. After all, he had experienced too many shocks in his life, and he was bold enough to be wild enough. Especially after entering the 2nd floor of the academy, his mind became more stable, even calm and lazy. So after returning to Lin 47th Street, his mood quickly returned to normal. At the entrance of the alley, an old cat was lying on the flagstone, squinting and lazily basking in the sun. In fact, Ning Ke was not lazy. In the following days, in order to avoid the enthusiastic Chang and citizens and stewards, he still got up before dark and went out early in the morning. He went to the back of the mountain of the academy to practice his swordsmanship, knife, and fine needles. He also listened to the wind, music, and chess. After leaving the academy, he continued to tour the scenery around Chang'an and visited various Taoist temples and ancient temples. However, he did not have his master to accompany him and was alone on the road. Chang'an city finally came to the most difficult period of the year, the hot and stuffy summer. Ning Ke had also visited more than a dozen Taoist temples and finally arrived at the Wanyan Tower in southern city. Unfortunately, spring had passed and the flock of geese had already gone north to Xuanyang Lake in Gushan Commandery to spend the summer. Therefore, he did not have the chance to see the stunning scene of tens of thousands of geese flying around the ancient tower. However, places like Taoist and Buddhist temples always like to steal the most beautiful scenery of the world as the background. Therefore, the Taoists and monks had no choice but to make some good scenery to avoid being criticized by the world. Therefore, although there were no geese to see in the Wanyan Tower, at least there was a Buddhist pagoda with moss marks on its ancient bricks and the exquisitely carved stone statues of venerables in the Buddha Hall. Ning Ke looked up at the Buddhist pagoda for a while and found that he did not understand anything about talisman Taoism, nor did he see any beauty. He shrugged and walked into the Buddha Hall. Suddenly, he was attracted by the smooth lines of the statues of venerables, which were extraordinarily solemn. The world was shrouded by Haotian's divine light. The Buddhism sect silently guarded in a corner of Yueluan Kingdom. Although some temples were built around various cities, they were not mainstream. Most of the monks of the Buddhism sect cultivated in the wilderness and had little influence on the secular people. Like most people, Ning Ke did not know much about the doctrines and scriptures of the Buddhism sect. He only knew that the status of the so-called venerables in the Buddhism sect was roughly equivalent to that of the saints that ordinary people talked about. Those were ancient myths and legends. The stone statues of venerables were placed in order in the quiet Buddha hall. The windows were covered with yellow paper. The filtered light fell on the stone statues, emitting a kind of tranquil yellowish luster. The stone statues of venerables were in different shapes. Some were smiling, some were silent, and some looked bitter. The hands that were exposed outside the monks' robes were also different. Some put their palms together, some clenched lightly, and some put their fingers together in a strange way. Ning Ke guessed that this should be the emblematic gesture of the Buddhism sect. He subconsciously imitated the statue according to the statue of the venerables. He stretched his hands out of the sleeves and slowly put his palms together. Then he spread his fingers and crossed them, or bent his fingers and lowered his wrists like a lotus. Gradually, he felt something in his heart, but he could not tell what it was. Walking out of the Buddha hall, the world was shrouded in bright and hot sunlight again. He blinked his eyes and shook his head in disappointment. When he was about to leave, a middle-aged monk walked out of the Wanyan Tower and smiled at him. In the shack on the top of the tower, the middle-aged monk put a cup of tea in front of Ning Ke and said calmly, "You can call me Huang Yang." Ning Ke took the tea and thanked him. He felt that the name was somewhat familiar. It seemed that he had heard Master Yen Sei mention it. "You must have some doubts as to why I invited you upstairs for a chat." The middle-aged monk looked at him and said with a smile, "I was invited by someone to say a few words to you." Ning Ke held the tepid tea and felt a little puzzled. "Who invited you? What do you want to say to me?" At this moment, he finally remembered the identity of this monk Huang Yang. Thinking of the rumors and stories he had heard in the past, he was suddenly shocked. He quickly stood up and bowed to the ground, saying, "Greetings, greetings, master." Huang Yang monk laughed and said, "Many people find it a little troublesome to call me. In the eyes of the common people, I am the so-called younger brother of the emperor, and many times they call me Lord Younger Brother of the Emperor. But I am not a lord, I am just a monk." Ning Ke smiled and didn't know how to answer. Monk Huang Yang pointed at the mountain-like Buddhist scriptures on the desk behind him and said, "These are the true scriptures of the Buddhism sect that I took back from the wilderness. I want to translate them into plain words so that the true meaning of the scriptures can be heard by the world. However, I've spent so many years and there are still many volumes that I haven't finished. So please don't mind me telling you directly." The middle-aged monk sitting opposite was the younger brother of the emperor of the Tang Empire, the most respected sublime being of the Buddhism sect in the empire. Up to now, Ning Ke had not guessed who invited him to talk to him. However, such a sublime being put aside so many Buddhist scriptures and specially took time to talk to him. Presumably, the content of the sublime being must be very important, so Ning Ke would not have the slightest objection. "I don't know much about the Tao of Runes, so I can only talk about the cultivation process that I have experienced. The Buddhism sect pays particular attention to enlightenment. Those who can hold the Buddha's heart are Buddhas. In our view, the surrounding chi of heaven and earth can be said to be a gift from Haotian or some kind of glory that has existed since ancient times. Whether Haotian has the same will as human beings or not, there has always been a debate whether Haotian has the same will as human beings, whether it is the Taoism sect, the Buddhism sect, or the predecessors of the Academy. Let's not talk about it today." Huang Yang monk's words were really direct, without any pleasantries or transitions. He directly put forward a big proposition, but stopped abruptly after a little explanation and quickly got to the point. The cultivation of the Buddhism sect is asceticism. The so-called asceticism is not to bear hardships, but to walk between heaven and earth and have intimate contact with the cliff and the stream for many years. Then one day when the cliff is still and the stream has a splash, you may be able to perceive the chi of heaven and earth. Cultivation pays attention to understanding the running rules of the chi of heaven and earth and perceiving how it flows and how it is still. The disciples of the Buddhism sect also need to learn, but our learning is more based on years of accumulation. When we suddenly figure these things out, we call it enlightenment. A real good student, even in the face of Einstein, would not be like the fish at the back of the mountain of the academy, wagging their tails and waiting to be fed by the goose. Instead, they would bravely and timely ask questions. Ning Ke was undoubtedly a good student. So after Huang Yang monk finished this sentence, he frowned and asked, by being extremely familiar with the objective existence of things, one can recognize all the properties of things. You summed it up very well. No wonder you can enter the second floor of the academy. Monk Huang Yang was slightly stunned and said with appreciation, that's the general idea. However, in the view of the Buddhism sect, the chi of heaven and earth existed before us and will always exist after us. It's an objective existence that transcends worldly experience and even survival experience. Therefore, when we live in it, it's more about feeling rather than mastering it, let alone trying to control it. Therefore, the Buddhism sect is not like the general cultivation sects, which divide states according to the degree of understanding and control of the laws of heaven and earth. There is no such thing as no doubts or see-through. How can one learn the endless heaven and earth with a limited life without doubts? Since it is the mystery of heaven and earth, how can one understand it thoroughly? Ning Ke seriously thought about these words and felt that these views of the Buddhism sect were a little too rigid, or at least not positive. The Buddhism sect only pays attention to enlightenment. If you understand it, then you understand it. If you don't, then you don't understand it. Huang Yang monk looked at him and said calmly, since I was a child, I followed my master to practice asceticism everywhere in the world. After my master passed away due to old age, I heard that there was a holy land of the Buddhism sect in the extreme west of the wilderness, so I went to the Yueluan kingdom and followed the caravan of the Yueluan kingdom into the wilderness. During the 7 years, I followed 17 different caravans into the wilderness. Some caravans stayed in the barbarian tribes and never came back. More caravans returned to the Yueluan kingdom with generous rewards, but I never found the legendary holy land of the Buddhism sect. One of the caravans entered the wilderness 4 times, and I followed them in and out 4 times. I was familiar with the merchants' coachmen and guards. One day, a sandstorm came, and the caravan was trapped in an earthen enclosure somewhere in Chiu City. At night, a team of horse gang, who came to avoid the sandstorm, also entered this earthen enclosure, and then there was no reason to kill them. Hearing the word horse gang, Ning Ke raised his eyebrows subconsciously, and a bright light appeared in his eyes. His body instinctively stiffened, and he was full of killing intent. He asked in a low voice, Master, what happened later? He knew that this question was unnecessary. He knew better than anyone else the cruelty of the horse gang in the wilderness, and the master was still sitting here, safe and sound. Something must have happened, and even the master was very likely to be enlightened that day. As expected, Huang Yang monk said, the horse gang was a little afraid of the disciples of the Buddhism sect. They didn't besiege me until they killed all the people. It was at that moment that I, who had followed my master for 20 years and been in and out of the wilderness for 7 years, was finally enlightened. Listening to the master's narration, Ning Ke seemed to be able to see the cruel scene of that night in the wilderness, and his mind was slightly shaken. He looked at the other side of the table and asked subconsciously, Master, what happened after you were enlightened? What happened to those horse gang later? Huang Yang monk smiled slightly and didn't answer the question. He just slowly poured some tea into his cup. Ning Ke smiled, knowing that he had asked another meaningless question. Although the Buddhism sect paid particular attention to mercy and enlightenment, he knew that the Buddhism sect also had a thunderous rage when encountering evildoers from the introduction of the furious eyes venerable in the Buddhism sect. Naturally, those horse gang were all killed. Huang Yang monk said, as for how I was enlightened at that time, I still don't understand until now. I only remember that my body was soaked with the blood of my familiar companions. I felt that the blood was very hot, and my skin was burning, as if it was about to be burned. Hearing this, Ning Ke gently rubbed his fingers under the table, feeling that the blood left in his childhood was still so sticky. Although it had faded a lot now, it still made him feel a little uncomfortable. Huang Yang monk looked at him and said, "For many years, I have been suffering and confused. Since I wanted to be enlightened, why couldn't I be enlightened earlier? Even if I had been enlightened half a day earlier, my friends in the caravan wouldn't have been killed by the horse gang." After a long time, I finally understood this truth. Everyone has different reasons for enlightenment and lucky chances. When the lucky chance comes, it comes. If it doesn't, you can't force it. Ning Ke understood that the master's words were to remind him. Huang Yang monk continued, "Blood is not fire. It shouldn't be spicy and can't be burned. However, for me at that time, blood was spicy and could burn my clothes, flesh, and even Buddha's heart. If enlightenment is the perception of the law of the chi of heaven and earth, then everyone's enlightenment should be different. Only what you feel is true, and what others teach you is false. So you don't have to worry. Take your time, and you will be enlightened eventually." Ning Ke pondered in silence for a long time. Then, he bowed deeply and walked down from the Wanyan Tower. A moment later, Li Qingshan, the master of nation of Tang, came in from nowhere. He looked at Huang Yang monk and said, "Thank you very much." Huang Yang monk shook his head and said, "With so many contacts in such a short time, don't you worry that he will have problems." Li Qingshan said calmly, "A divine talisman master who has already stood at the threshold, a virtuous brother of the Buddhism sect, and those eccentrics in the second floor of the academy. With such a lineup to guide a young man who has just entered the cultivation world, if he doesn't have any problems, then his future must be promising. If this still doesn't work, then, we can only wait for the headmaster of academy to return home." The grand cultivators who stood at the top of the Tang Empire were all devoted to the education of Ning Quebec. Just as the nation master Li Qingshan had said, such a lineup might not be impossible in the future, but it was highly unlikely to appear in the past. After a moment of silence, Huang Yang monk smiled and said, "I hope he can live up to your expectations in the future." The military ministry and the Imperial Center administration have also investigated him in detail. His loyalty to the Tang Empire is beyond doubt. Being able to enter the second floor of the academy means that he has enough potential, and even has the possibility to become a divine talisman master in the future. The most important thing is that he is not like other cultivators who are ignorant of worldly affairs and walk in the clouds. Instead, he acts calmly and coldly. When encountering an enemy, he dares to kill and is willing to use any means. How could His Majesty miss such a young man? Not to mention the fate of that calligraphy section. His painstaking efforts to cultivate him with such a lineup is not because we old guys expect him to grow up and bring glory to us in the future, but because the Tang Empire needs young people like him in the future. Since that day in the palace, Ning Ke had sent some calligraphy sections to the Tang Empire through the bodyguard office after eating the exquisite but not filling royal meal of cold fire autumn smoke. He had never entered the palace again, nor had he met the emperor of the Tang Empire. Therefore, he did not know that he had become the most important candidate for the Tang Empire's talent cultivation plan. However, after talking with Master Huang Yang at Wanyan Tower today, he more or less guessed some things. The reason why the younger brother of the Tang Empire could come out in person, besides the face of Master Yen Sei, must be because of the palace. Even if he had guessed some things, he was not shocked, especially compared to a few days ago in the southern city, when his master pointed to the picturesque landscape and said that the safety of this magnificent city would be handed over to him in the future. But of course, he would feel touched. A few days after the talk at Wanyan Tower, he had been thinking about Master Huang Yang's words, especially the word enlightenment. The more he thought about it, the more he was sure that the Enlightenment Buddhism sect paid attention to, if put in the system of ordinary cultivation methods, was actually see-through, which was the preliminary mastery of the operation of the Qi of heaven and earth. At this time, Ning Kei's state was still at no doubt state, only a small distance away from the lower state of see-through. The same was true for talisman Taoism. He was only a little bit away from drawing that talisman, but this seemingly small distance was actually the most difficult part. Seeing that there was only one step away from climbing the dangerous peak, but that step could not be taken, no matter who it was, they would inevitably feel anxious and anxious. A few days ago, Ning Kei did manage to be calm, but of course, deep in his heart, he had been looking forward to the arrival of that day. It was not until he heard Master Huang Yang's words about enlightenment at Wanyan Tower that he suddenly realized that these seemingly peaceful and natural expectations were also a kind of anxiety and an obstacle to cultivation. After pondering for a night, Ning Kei no longer thought about these things. See-through and talisman Taoism were all left behind by him. He would still go to the academy's back mountain to listen to songs, forge iron and gossip, and still walk around the famous places in Chang'an. But he no longer thought about when he would be able to reach see-through, nor did he think about when he would be able to put down the first stroke on that piece of white paper. Looking at the eaves of the famous buildings, he no longer wanted to feel anything from them. Instead, he just purely appreciated the beauty among them, reflecting and imprinting those lines into his eyes. One day in midsummer. In the afternoon, the old brush pen shop was shrouded in unbearable heat and humidity. Ning Kei leaned on the bamboo chair under the tree, staring at the sky divided by branches and green leaves in a daze. From time to time, he picked up a wet towel from the basin beside the chair and patted it on his body, washing away the greasy sweat and summer heat with the well water. Change the water quickly. The water in the basin is hot again. What kind of weather is this? Get some fresh cold well water quickly. He was not anxious about cultivation, but anxious about the heat. He shouted to the front. In order to resist the endless stream of admirers and stewards of mansions, the old brush pen shop was now open for 2 days and 3 days when its owner got married. Sang Sang was really bored during the day, so she wiped the tables and chairs in the front shop again and again. At this time, hearing Ning Kei's angry shout in the courtyard, she hurriedly ran out and poured the old water in the basin under the tree, and then went to the well to get new water. At this moment, the long-awaited rain fell, hitting the eaves and leaves with pitter-patter. Then, it quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The rain was like thunder, but it could not drown out the ecstatic shouts of the neighbors in the back alley. "Young master, quickly go into the house to hide." Sang Sang threw down the basin and hurriedly closed the window. Ning Kei lay on the bamboo chair, but did not move. He looked at the rain falling from the sky, feeling the brittle feeling of the raindrops hitting his naked skin, and the wetness that enveloped the street. His expression seemed a little strange. Sang Sang looked at him from the window and shouted, "Why don't you come in?" Ning Kei opened his eyes and looked at the increasingly dense rain. He suddenly shouted, "Look, it's so beautiful." Sang Sang thought that the young master was talking nonsense again. She waited for a long time and found that Ning Kei was still lying on the bamboo chair. Although she was not worried that he would catch a cold on such a hot day, she was very worried that he would become a fool in the rain. Frowning, she walked out of the door, walked to the bamboo chair, and imitated him to look up at the sky. Seeing that she looked up with difficulty, Ning Kei stretched out his hand to hold her waist, and held her in his arms. The master and the servant lay side by side on the bamboo chair, lying in the majestic heavy rain, and opened their eyes to look at the sky. Sang Sang looked at the rain coming like arrows, and said in surprise, "It's really beautiful." Ning Kei wiped the rain off her face and asked, "Do you feel that we are like the rain eaves under 1,000 years of wind and rain?" Sang Sang shook her head and said, "I don't think so. I feel like the city wall is being shot by many arrows." Ning Kei sighed and said, "What an unromantic girl." At night, the rain gradually stopped. Sang Sang began to cook. After drying his body, Ning Kei came to the desk in front of the window again. He poured water into the inkstone, ground the ink, and picked up the brush, as natural and ordinary as he had done every time for more than 10 years. The white paper on the desk was still the original one. The edges had been rolled up after dozens of days, but the top was still white. He looked away from the page of the Talisman Classics, and then looked at the rain dripping from the eaves. Then he lowered his wrist and put down the brush. The full tip of the brush, like a treetop full of rain, gently fell on the snow-white paper. 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, 6 lines. 6 lines were finished. Ning Kai took a deep breath and put down the brush. Sang Sang came in with 2 big bowls of soy sauce rice, put them aside, and walked to the desk to look at it curiously. Then she looked up at the roof, slightly frowning, and said unhappily, "It's leaking. Isn't this a new house built in the 4th year of the Tianqi era? Young master, you have to talk to Mr. Qi tomorrow to reduce the rent." Ning Kai shook his head helplessly and said, "When did we pay the rent? Besides, the house is not leaking." "It's not leaking. Young master, did you get a fever because of the rain? Do you need me to go to the pharmacy?" Sang Sang pointed to the white paper on the desk and looked at Ning Kai with concern. However, before she could finish, Ning Kai pulled her thin body into his arms. Sang Sang felt that the young master seemed to be very emotional today, so she could only helplessly open her arms and let him hold her. Ning Kai held her tightly. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile in her ear, "Tell all the people in Chang and who want to invite me to dinner that from today on, I have time to go to their mansions for dinner." Hearing this, Sang Sang's body slightly stiffened, and she looked at the desk again. The 6 ink marks on the snow-white paper on the desk had disappeared. There was only a big puddle of water. Not rain. It was water. "I had originally planned to write 3,000 words, but as I was writing and writing, I got too excited. So I wrote 6,000 words and finished writing this huge plot. Alright, I'm really happy. At such a happy time, I'll feel sorry for myself if I don't ask for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Anyway, you know that recommendation votes are my life. I can ask for monthly votes casually, but you really can't give them casually, you have to give them hard. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 181. Of course, Ning Kai was very happy to draw the first talisman in his life. Then he calmed down and sighed with emotion. But he was not as ecstatic as he was when he embarked on the road of cultivation last year. Cultivation had tortured him for more than 10 years. He had been desperate but suddenly succeeded. But talisman Taoism was a matter of course. He knew that he could understand it, but he did not know when he could. Of course, it was impossible for him to announce it to the whole world. He only told the people closest to him. Then, he was surprised to find that the reaction of these people was even stronger than his. For a moment, he couldn't help but wonder who wrote the water talisman on the snow-white paper on the desk. Sang Sang went to the Victory House to invite a chef to make the table noodles. Senior brothers and sisters in the back mountain of the academy spread the news. They thought that their youngest brother would be obsessed with talisman Taoism and would not practice the flying sword anymore. So their heads and the butt of the big white goose would be much safer. So they danced with their hands and feet, played the flute and played the zither. After Master Yen Sei knew the news, he sat in the Southern Gate Temple for a while and then went to the House of Red Sleeves to indulge in drinking. When he was drunk, 2 lines of tears flowed down his old face. On the 3rd day after the summer rain, the highly respected old chancellor of the Tang Empire held a banquet in his mansion with a random excuse. Dozens of officials were invited to the banquet. They drank and made merry under the rain-shielding veranda in the courtyard. Everyone was confused, but it was not appropriate for them to ask. Naturally, the important figures of the imperial court would not sit in the courtyard with these middle-level officials. Instead, they were chatting with the old chancellor in the main room. As they listened to the chancellor's hearty laughter, the doubts in their hearts were even stronger than those of the officials outside. They were all guessing what kind of joyous event had happened that could actually make the stern old chancellor, who led the literary world with his scholarly articles, so happy. Could it be that the border army had conquered a large piece of territory for the empire, or that the old chancellor's granddaughter was about to get married? On such an occasion, no matter what happened, everyone should have fun. But looking at the white-haired old chancellor sitting on the left side of the old chancellor, even the minister of the Ministry of Rights could not say much. That person was Wang Shichen, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library. Throughout the entire imperial court, apart from the Prime Minister and a few others, only this Grand Secretary would dare to disrespect the old chancellor. Moreover, everyone knew that these two elders had never gotten along. The chancellor and the grand scholar hadn't been on good terms with each other for a long time, but it had nothing to do with the political opinions or the internal strife. The great Tang placed great importance on the law, and even the nobles did not dare to violate it. The various departments acted according to the law, and although there were no harsh punishments, it was extremely difficult to brush past the edges of the law. As a result, no minister dared to form a clique for personal gain. The few ministers and ministers in the main room knew clearly that the hatred between the two old chancellors stemmed from a love affair decades ago. At that time, both of them were students of the academy. They shared the same room and shared a deep friendship. It was a pity that they shared the same room with a young girl, and the girl was the Prime Minister's daughter. Her temperament was unbelievably good, and the most unfortunate thing was that the Prime Minister only had one daughter, so Wang Shichen, the Grand Secretary, sneered and stroked his white beard. He looked at the old chancellor and said, "I heard that you often sent stewards to Lin 47th Street recently, and even bought a few sections from others." "That's right. Are you jealous?" The old chancellor smiled and looked at him, saying, "Don't talk about losing the face of the imperial court. Ning Ke is a student of the academy, and we are old acquaintances. Moreover, he has entered the second floor. What's more, I have to show him respect even though I'm much older. I heard that your steward often goes to the old brush pen shop these days. Why do you have to talk about me? Look, if you didn't have a guilty conscience, why would you answer so many questions with just a few questions?" Grand Secretary Wang sneered and said sarcastically, "Ning Ke's calligraphy is really good. His Majesty likes it, and so do I. What's wrong with me sending someone to the old brush pen shop? I just sympathize with you. You have been searching everywhere, and I don't know if you have found any authentic works." Before the old chancellor answered, Grand Secretary Wang laughed and looked at his colleagues around the table. He said, "I think you all know that Sir Ning's chicken soup calligraphy is now in my mansion. I have a look at it when I have time for official business. It's really a good feeling." The old chancellor slightly raised his eyebrows. He knew that this sentence was directed at him. Grand Secretary Wang slightly raised his eyebrows and continued to say, intentionally or unintentionally, "There are many sections of Ning Ke's calligraphy circulating outside. But except for this chicken soup calligraphy with the hidden meaning of divine talisman, I don't think there is another one that can be compared with the flower blooming calligraphy in the palace. It did take me some effort to get this chicken soup calligraphy. If I didn't have some friendship with Master Yen Sei, how could I get it?" He turned to the old chancellor and said with a smile, "Old guy, I heard that your steward also went to the House of Red Sleeves to buy 2 rubbings of the Yen family of the chicken soup calligraphy. Why do you do that? If you really want to see the authentic chicken soup calligraphy, just tell me. Why do you specially invite me to have this meal? Why do you have to bother so many colleagues to accompany you?" The old chancellor breathed heavily. He put his hands on the table and sneered, "If I want to see it, you will send it to my mansion. Don't even think about it." Grand Secretary Wang smiled and said, "His Majesty knows that the chicken soup calligraphy is in my mansion and has asked me for it 3 times. I didn't do it. The chicken soup calligraphy will definitely not come back to the palace. If I send it to your mansion, you will definitely not give it back to me. How can I be fooled? His Majesty has been to my mansion twice this month. If you want to see it, just come to my mansion. Big Head Wang. Don't bully me too much. The old chancellor slammed the table and scolded harshly. The master of moral essay called Wang Shichen by his nickname in the academy out of anger today. It was really unbearable. If it were in normal times, Wang Shichen would probably scold him. However, he had the absolute upper hand with the chicken soup calligraphy today. He could show pity to the loser. He shook his head indifferently and said sympathetically, "You are too impolite. You are too impolite." The old chancellor thought of the purpose of today's banquet. He forcibly suppressed his anger and sat down slowly. He sneered and said, "Today I have another purpose for this banquet." Just you. Do you think you have a big head and a big face? Grand Secretary Wang smiled slightly and did not care. Finally, this sentence is used again. The two senior statesmen quarreled and mocked each other. The ministers and chancellors at the table did not dare to interrupt. They were used to this scene and knew that it was useless to persuade them. So they could only maintain an awkward silence. Not long after, there was a slight sound in the courtyard. It seemed that a guest had arrived. Grand Secretary Wang looked out of the threshold and frowned slightly. The old chancellor smiled and looked at the young man who walked into the courtyard surrounded by several young men. He stroked his long beard with satisfaction and squinted at him. He said, "The authentic chicken soup calligraphy. Let's take a look at the owner of the chicken soup calligraphy first." At this time, these bigwigs of the imperial court had already guessed the identity of the young man. Although they more or less knew this person before, they could not help but sigh in their hearts when they found that he was so young. Grand Secretary Wang's expression was very ugly. In spring, the entire Chang'an city was shocked by the appearance of the owner of the flower-blooming calligraphy. Many high-ranking officials and nobles wanted to get close to this person in order to please the emperor. Even Ning Ke himself had sent a steward to invite this person to his mansion for a chat. However, no one expected that this person would turn a blind eye to all the invitations and continue to live peacefully in the shabby alley. Usually, if a calligrapher showed this kind of attitude to the bigwigs of the empire, even if he was the second master of calligrapher, he would be instantly defeated until no one paid attention to him. However, this young calligrapher was quite favored by His Majesty and was also a student of the second floor of the academy. Even these high-ranking officials and nobles did not dare to do anything to him and could only let him be with love and hate. As time passed, the Chang'an prefectures found that this person treated everyone like this and had never attended the banquet of the He family. They thought that cultivators had many different interests and gradually did not care about it. When it was time to buy the calligraphy, he still did not show any mercy. However, who would have thought that today, this person actually appeared at the banquet of the old chancellor? The Tang officials inside and outside the courtyard were all extremely smart people. It only took a moment for them to roughly guess why this calligrapher made an exception. Wang Shichen sneered and turned to look at the old chancellor. He said sarcastically, "Congratulations on having a good granddaughter." The hidden meaning in this sentence was actually a little vicious. But just like Grand Secretary Wang's previous verbal attack on the old chancellor, only the winner was qualified to be forgiven. The old chancellor smiled and mocked, "Who told your granddaughter to be unable to enter the academy?" This sentence was the biggest regret of Grand Secretary Wang in the past 3 years. His expression slightly changed and his fingers slightly trembled. He pointed at the old chancellor's face and angrily scolded, "You old man, don't be so proud." The old chancellor sighed and said, "As the first old man in Chang'an to invite Sir Ning to his mansion, it is hard not to be proud." Grand Secretary Wang looked back at Ning Ke who had walked out of the threshold and said angrily, "Do you need to look at an old hen to drink chicken soup?" The old chancellor smiled generously and shook his head with a sigh. "You are so out of control. There was a heavy rain in midsummer the day before yesterday. Ning Ke wrote an inked talisman on the snow-white paper and then said that sentence to Sang Sang. Then he began to go to the banquets of each family. The master and the handmaiden checked and found that they had actually collected more than a dozen invitations and name cards in just a month or two. He was very clear that the reason why these bigwigs in Chang'an treated him so courteously was all for the sake of His Majesty. Previously, he treated everyone equally and did not go to any family. Of course, he was not afraid because he was at the back of the mountain of the academy. But once he started to go to the banquets, he must pay attention to the order. Otherwise, if he offended some bigwigs in the imperial court because of etiquette, even the academy could not help him. Yesterday at the lakeside of the academy, he seriously consulted Situelan and finally decided to put the invitation to the old chancellor's mansion as the first one. The reason was very simple. Since the old chancellor was a noble and civil official, it was natural for him to meet him as a junior disciple. More importantly, it was because Jin Wuxia was his classmate. This kind of relationship could not be found anywhere in the world. Of course, the dishes in the old chancellor's mansion were much better than those in the imperial palace. But they were too bland, and the conversation was really not very interesting. Ning Ke honestly and humbly answered the questions in accordance with the unchangeable truth that these bigwigs gave him face, which was that he had to return the face back to them. He behaved very well. After the banquet, the old chancellor naturally asked people to bring up the brush, ink, paper and inkstone, and asked Ning Ke to leave a letter. After leaving the letter, Jin Wuxia and Situelan saw him out of the mansion together. The three chatted for a while, and then Ning Ke knew that Xie Qingyun had returned to the South Jin Kingdom when he was busy understanding Talisman Taoism. Ning Ke noticed that when Situelan mentioned Xie Qingyun, Jin Wuxia's expression was still calm, but her eyes were a little sad. He could not help but sigh. Since they had started to attend the banquet, it was impossible for them to just stay in one family. The next day, according to the meal schedule arranged by Situelan, he was supposed to visit the Minister of the Ministry of Rites. However, because he met Grand Secretary Wang at the old Chancellor's mansion last night, he had no choice but to go to the Grand Secretary Wang's mansion for dinner. Before Ning Ke agreed with him at the table, he had clearly felt that if he did not agree with the white-haired Grand Secretary Wang, the latter would really send someone to Lin 47th Street to smash his shop. The banquet in the Grand Secretary Wang's mansion was more exaggerated than that in the old Chancellor's mansion. It was obvious that the old man did not treat Ning Ke as an old hen who would simply feed him some rice. Instead, he invited all the capable officials of the 6 ministries and 3 academies to the mansion. If one counted carefully, he would find that more than half of the officials who were qualified to attend the court meeting were standing in the courtyard. Looking at the dense crowd of officials in the courtyard and the various official uniforms, Ning Ke was so shocked that he was completely speechless. He thought to himself, what did this lad do? He was just a bad calligrapher. How could he deserve such a grand ceremony? However, Grand Secretary Wang thought that he deserved it. He even took Ning Ke's hand and stood in front of the steps, making a very grand introduction. For the academy and the headmaster, for the imperial palace and His Majesty, for the Southern Gate Temple and Yen Sei, Grand Secretary Wang did not mind giving face. Of course, he also vaguely wanted to put on airs. On the one hand, he wanted to use these officials to announce to the whole empire that Ning Ke had come for dinner. On the other hand, he wanted to use these officials to announce to Ning Ke that he treated him more attentively than the old chancellor. In the future, if Ning Ke had any calligraphy, he should show it to me first. If His Majesty had any instructions, he should let me know first. Before the banquet was over, Grand Secretary Wang took out the treasured chicken soup calligraphy and asked the officials to appreciate it. Finally, he asked Ning Ke to take out his private seal and solemnly stamp his own seal on the memo paper that had been repaired but was still wrinkled. Ning Ke lifted his finger slightly, and the seal left the surface of the chicken soup calligraphy, leaving a dazzling bright red. There was jubilation in the Grand Secretary's mansion. The officials cheered and applauded. The steward of the mansion was proud and moved, and the servants whispered. Old Song, who had followed the Grand Secretary all the way from his hometown to Chang'an and had served the Grand Secretary for nearly 70 years, was moved to tears. He held his walking stick and looked at the brightly lit courtyard. He said in a trembling voice, "Old master, young master has finally won against the old Jin. The hatred of stealing his wife has finally been somewhat avenged." After doing this, Ning Kai heaved a sigh of relief. He thought that this was probably the case. However, he did not expect that Grand Secretary Wang did not intend to let him leave. Instead, he ordered people to set up the writing brushes, ink, paper and inkstone, just like the old chancellor had done last night. Looking at the speed of the steward setting up the brushes, ink, paper and inkstone, no one in the hall would believe that they did not carry out emergency overtime training. Ning Kai stared blankly at the ridiculously large Huangzhou sprout paper in front of him. He wanted to cry but had no tears. He thought to himself that the old chancellor had only taken an ordinary scroll last night. Did he want him to write a Grand Central Hall? Isn't this a little too cruel? After leaving the Grand Secretary's mansion, he said to Sang Sang sadly, "Don't ever attend such banquets again." Sang Sang asked confusedly, "Young master, you said a few days ago that if you want to achieve great things, you can't just rely on one skill. Although you are determined to cultivate, you also need to build a good relationship with the bigwigs in the secular world. Why do you say not to attend such banquets again now? I'm still good at eating, chatting, praising the sage, and flattering people because I'm a thick-skinned person." Ning Kai shook his head and said with emotion, "However, I have to leave a piece of calligraphy after eating. Yesterday it was an ordinary scroll, and today it has become a Grand Central Hall. What should I write when the Marquis invites me to dinner tomorrow? Should I fill the white wall that the Marquis just painted with calligraphy? These bigwigs are not inviting me to dinner. They are completely robbing me of my money. I'm really happy when I write about Old Song. In fact, I'm still tired from writing, and I'm not in good spirits. That's why I've stayed up until now. It's past midnight, and I don't have to send out individual chapters to solicit recommendation votes. I'm sincerely inviting you here. The recommendation votes on Monday are very important, and I hope everyone can support me. Please come to my appointment to solicit votes. We eat rice, but what flows out must be votes. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian to cast a recommendation vote or a monthly vote. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 182. Because he could not bear to part with his beautiful concubine, the emperor did not attend the morning court. Because he could not bear to fight for gold over silver, Ning Kai did not eat from then on. What he meant by not eating was that he did not attend banquets, not because he really disliked the Tang Empire and wanted to express his dissatisfaction by not eating anything. He had experienced the terrible drought and famine when he was a child and was deeply traumatized by it. He insisted that eating was the most important thing in this world, because there were no immortals in the world who could eat wind and drink dew. Even the most powerful sage of sword, Liu Bai, would be starving if he did not eat for a few days. Anyone who did not eat would die. Eating and drinking. In those years when there was no food, even a naked beauty was probably no different from meat in the eyes of many men, not to mention things like roses that represented love. The Buddhism sect always liked to preach about pink skulls. Ning Kai could not help but secretly guess that those sadhus ate vegetables and tofu gruel every day and had to climb mountains and ridges. They were in a state of half-starvation every day, and that was why they came up with such a correct and idiotic argument. And Yueluan Kingdom was the most prosperous place for Buddhism, so there might be some connection between the two. The people who were so hungry that they did not even have the strength to curse the heavens might not be interested in doing those things between men and women, so they had to tighten their belts and chant sutras. Ning Kai's ideas were naturally not correct, but at least there was a hidden rule in human history. The most fundamental reason for the wars between tribes and countries was to eat. To fill their stomachs, the refugees dared to attack states, capture cities and fight with the regular armies of various countries. In order to fill the stomachs of their people and prevent them from risking their lives against them, the various countries did not hesitate to shed all pretenses of cordiality and put down their statuses to forcefully seize more land. Similarly, to fill their stomachs, the tribes of the wilderness of the north, which had been away from the central plains for more than 1,000 years, were forced to move south with great difficulty. They took the initiative to attack the fierce barbarian tribes on the grassland, regardless of whether they would alarm the countries in the central plains or whether they would bring any future troubles. Wars were for eating. Of course, in order to win wars, the first thing to do was to ensure that the people in the war had enough to eat. On the slightly cold grassland, the smoke rising from dozens of earthen stoves and the mutton being cooked in dozens of big pots was a guarantee. Thousands of men dressed in animal skins sat around the earthen stove, silently eating mutton. Whether it was the wrinkled old men or the immature young men, they all had calm and resolute expressions, as if they hadn't just traveled thousands of miles to the south, but had lived here for many years. They were a part of the army of the Northern Wasteland tribe. In other words, they were a part of all the men who could fight in the Northern Wasteland tribe. In this southern expedition, all the men who could fight in the Northern Wasteland tribe were gathered here. There was no army. Instead, all the men who could fight were gathered on the edge of the grassland that stretched for hundreds of miles. All the old, weak, women, and children of the tribe were left behind. It would take about a month to reach the edge of the grassland. If the men could not win this war and take over the grassland, then their families in the wilderness behind them would definitely be swallowed by the darkness, cold, hunger, and the blades of the enemy. For countless years, the Northern Wasteland tribe lived in the cold region of the far north, relying on the hot sea to survive. It was impossible for them to sustain too many people. In recent years, as the nights strangely lengthened, the temperature gradually dropped, and their lives became more and more difficult. At the end of winter, the tribal elders finally decided to move the whole tribe south. If they did not move south, there would be no food. In the south, there were large grasslands, sheep, and food. It was a pity that the god was not generous when he gave the land to the humans. Most of the land already had an owner, including this large piece of fertile grassland. If the people of the northern wilderness wanted the grassland and the food for the sheep, the original owner would not be happy. So, then they would fight. After 1,000 years, the desolate man reappeared in the eyes of the world. This matter should have shocked the world. However, the people who once roared proudly on the grassland and defeated the countries in the Central Plains had left the world for too long. It was so long that many people had forgotten their existence. Moreover, the dangerous natural environment and the torture of time had reduced the tribe's population to the point that people did not feel any threat. Therefore, this matter was temporarily limited to the northern grassland. The reason for this situation also had a lot to do with the wise decision of the desolate man's tribal elders. Before moving south, the desolate man had set a firm and clear goal. The grassland that the sword pointed at belonged to the barbarian Lieutenant Khan, and had nothing to do with the countries in the Central Plains, especially the powerful and terrifying empire. Although the desolate man's soldiers were brave, they had been cautiously suppressing the war in the northern area of the grassland. It had been nearly a month since the desolate man's southern expedition troops arrived at the northern edge of the grassland, and the battle with the barbarian Lieutenant Khan's cavalry had been going on for a month. On this battle line that was deliberately controlled to a length of hundreds of kilometers, the two sides had fought no less than 100 battles, and most of them ended in the desolate man's victory. The cruelty of war was that even the winner had to pay the price of death. The desolate man's soldiers were silent and resolute, brave and disciplined, and their individual combat effectiveness was far above that of the grassland barbarians. However, they were too few in number. Although they continuously defeated the tide-like attacks of the Lieutenant Khan's 100,000 cavalry, more and more of their companions died. An earth stove, an iron pot, fresh water, and mutton. Not far away on the grassland were the corpses of their companions that had congealed in a pool of blood. A desolate man-sorcerer, whose face was smeared with tree sap, walked calmly among the corpses. From time to time, he squatted down and gently touched the eyebrows of the dead with his fingers. His dry lips moved slightly, making indecipherable syllables. Not far from the corpses of the soldiers, a desolate man-boy of about 13 or 14 years old blew the bone flute in his hand. The sound of the flute was mournful, as if it was telling the desolate man's pain of wandering and struggling for survival in the past 1,000 years. An old voice was added to the sound of the flute. It was a highly respected true master of the Council of Elders. He sang a song that all the desolate men could sing. The song was desolate and vigorous, with a shocking unyieldingness in the solemn and stirring atmosphere. The sky is cold, the earth is cold, the goshawk does not dare to look at the northern wilderness. The hot sea falls, the hot sea rises, the snow wolf is hunted by the hot sea. The snow wolf chases, the snow wolf dies, holding a knife to look for the deer all day long. Where to live, where to die, where to bury the white bones. Min Mountain is majestic, Min Mountain is strong, Min Mountain is the true hometown. Stepping over the vast snow, stepping over the frost for thousands of miles, looking south all day long. Stepping over the vast snow, stepping over the frost for thousands of miles, no longer looking south. I go first, and then you come. I fight first, and then you come. I die first, and then you come. The homeward journey is near, the homeward journey is far, the homeward journey is on. I have gone, and then you come. I have fought, and then you come. I have died, and then you come. I have died, and then you come. I have died, and then you come. The bleak song kept repeating the last two lines, and several young desolate man-warriors silently looked over there. As the old man sang softly, a strong but not sad atmosphere arose on the grassland. Most of the desolate man-warriors remained silent. They ate the mutton and drank the oily soup that had a strong odor. They seized every moment to replenish their strength in between the battles because no one knew when the next battle would begin. The ancestors of the desolate man were once called natural warriors by the people of the Central Plains. Now they had experienced thousands of years of harsh environment, and the word fighting was written in their blood vessels and bones. The death of their companions would not make them feel the slightest bit. Even the song that had been passed down for thousands of years could only trigger the soft echo deep in their hearts, but could not interfere with their preparation for the battle. At this moment, the bugle of the battle sounded again. The grassland trembled slightly, and no one knew how many elite cavalries of the Khan of the left tent were coming. The desolate man-warriors did not panic. They put down the mutton and spoon in their hands, raised their sleeves to wipe their oily faces, and then picked up the heavy and damaged weapons beside them. They slowly walked south, and even did not forget to put out the fire in the earthen stove. They walked slowly, then quickly, then trotted, and finally began to sprint. The way the desolate man-soldiers entered the battlefield was shockingly similar to the way the grassland cavalries did. The only difference was that they did not ride on horses and only had their own legs. However, what was incredible was that these desolate man-soldiers, who were wearing leather robes and holding knives and axes, who did not look very tall or strong, could run at such a fast speed and with such a shocking momentum. With the dense buzzing sound of drums, the grassland cavalries who were good at riding and shooting pulled the bowstrings of their short bows from a long distance away. Countless arrows cut through the sky and hit thousands of desolate man-warriors like raindrops. With a puff, a sharp arrow hit a desolate man-warrior who was running at high speed. After the arrowhead penetrated the leather armor, it seemed to take root in his chest. Blood quickly seeped out and dyed the leather armor red. However, the desolate man-warrior did not seem to notice it and still rushed towards the black tide-like cavalries with sabers and axes in his hands. Obviously, the arrow was blocked by the desolate man's steel-like skin and did not hurt his vital parts. There were no military orders or flag signals. The desolate man's battle relied on their instincts, the tacit understanding and the trust they had in their companions after fighting side by side for more than 1,000 years. When they were dozens of steps away from the black tide-like grassland cavalries, as long as they were not shot down by the cavalry's arrows, they pulled out the sharp axes from their waists neatly and threw them out with all their strength. The sharp axes rotated at high speed and cut through the air on the battlefield. The bright light reflected the sunlight and reflected snow-white shadows on the green grassland. It looked extremely beautiful and terrifying. With their strong defensive power, the desolate man warriors withstood the grassland cavalry's first round of shooting and entered the effective killing range of the flying axes. They ran so fast that the grassland cavalries did not have time to launch the second round of shooting and had to throw the axes in their hands. The rain of arrows did not hit too many desolate man warriors on the grassland, but the rain of thousands of sharp axes directly caused the grassland cavalries to suffer the cruelest blow. The originally heavy axes, coupled with the desolate man warriors throwing strength and rotation, easily cut through the cavalry's light armor. Even the ends of the axes directly broke the grassland cavalry's bones and spurted blood. To say a few very important things, first, after I finished writing last night, I was working on the next chapter's outline. I was deducing and overruling it all the way. I don't know if I was excited by the future plot or depressed by the level of trouble. Anyway, I had insomnia and couldn't fall asleep until noon. So I didn't sleep at all and hoped to adjust my biological clock again. However, I really couldn't stand it in the afternoon. I spent 4 to 5 hours writing this chapter. The quality and mood should be fine, but I really don't know the words because my eyes are blurry. I will go to sleep after eating the food my leader brought back. If I wake up tomorrow, I will try to write more. There is another very important thing to report to everyone, which is the annual selection. To be honest, with the help of everyone, I won the best author 2 years ago and the best novel last year. I am really grateful and satisfied. I really don't know what to do this year. Anyway, if you want to vote for me for free, I am still deeply grateful. But please don't spend money to vote for me. I really have nothing to ask for. The book review section moderators also have the best novel selection, but I don't know why our moderators are not in the designated range. Scratching my head, they have really worked hard these months. I am very clear about this, so I want to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to them. Bye, everyone. This paragraph does not count. What I said before is really not polite, I really have nothing to ask for. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 183. The sharp axes that whistled through the air and then fell deeply into the warhorses' heads, cutting off the grassland cavalrymen's arms. Along with a sudden muffled howl, countless warhorses fell to the ground miserably and the grassland men on the warhorses also fell to the ground miserably. Death and blood did not destroy the grassland cavalrymen's will to fight. Instead, it made the elite cavalrymen under the direct command of the left king's palace more aggressive. They waved the machetes in their hands and roared as they charged forward against the rain of axes. Contrary to the almost crazy grassland cavalrymen, the desolate man soldiers had remained silent since the beginning of the battle. Whether it was running at high speed, dodging the rain of arrows, falling to the ground due to injuries, or throwing the flying axes with all their strength, they kept their lips tightly shut. On the battlefield that was filled with blood and broken limbs, the silence was even more terrifying. However, if there were bystanders at the edge of the battlefield, in their eyes, the grassland cavalrymen who were charging forward with wild roars had far surpassed the silent desolate man soldiers in terms of momentum. The black tides formed by the grassland cavalrymen finally approached the silent desolate man soldiers and collided with them for the first time. What was incredible was that the silent desolate man's soldiers, who appeared to be lacking momentum, were not scattered by the heavy cavalry. They stood in the black tide like reefs and were not scattered. A young desolate man soldier squatted down and slashed his long saber from his waist. The grassland cavalrymen who were charging towards him were shocked and suddenly lowered their heads. The warhorse under them screamed and its two front legs were neatly chopped off. A strong desolate man soldier looked at the grassland cavalrymen who were charging towards him. He stepped forward with his right foot, lowered his body and bent his waist, and slammed into them with his shoulder. No matter how one looked at it, a human body hitting a horse was suicidal. However, this strong desolate man's shoulder was as hard as steel. The angle he chose to hit was so accurate that he just avoided the cavalry's machete and hit the warhorse's front leg, the shoulder blade, the most vulnerable part. There was a muffled howl from a man or a horse. The warhorse neighed and rolled over. The grassland cavalryman on the horse perfectly demonstrated his riding skills at this moment. He flipped over and got off the saddle, avoiding the tragic ending of being crushed by the heavy warhorse. However, just as his feet landed on the ground, the strong desolate man soldier's long saber came whistling and chopped off his head. Splash! The black tide formed by the grassland cavalryman came over. The desolate man soldier stood in the black tide with his long saber in his hand and was instantly engulfed. But after a while, the black tide splashed with countless waves of blood. However, these mature and naive desolate man soldiers once again surfaced and faced the second tide with blood all over their bodies. The tide overflowed the reef and then slowly receded. The reef still stood silently by the sea, as if it would never be washed away by the tide even after millions of years. The desolate warriors were not senseless reefs. In the face of the black tide of grassland cavalries, they did not choose to remain silent forever and fight recklessly. Instead, they made a second response at the fastest speed. Their feet, which were tied with animal skins, ran quickly on the grassland that had hardened due to the cold. Bringing grass and dirt with them, the desolate man warriors were like countless shadows weaving through the black tide of grassland cavalries. They avoided the accurate arrows, the sharp machetes, and the impact of the warhorses. They stayed close to each other tacitly and surrounded the grassland cavalrymen in the middle of the black tide in groups of 5. The scene was wonderful. The black tide of the grassland cavalrymen had flooded the entire battlefield, but they could not engulf these desolate man soldiers in the shortest time. And those desolate man soldiers did not care about the sabers and arrows behind them. They did not care about the grassland cavalrymen who were surrounded by 5 people. Some of them waved their long sabers and rushed up silently and fiercely. The long sabers were sharp and cut through the air. Their feet flashed like the wind. Wherever blood splashed, some grassland cavalrymen fell from their saddles and were instantly cut into pieces by the saber wind. The grassland cavalrymen on the periphery and the cavalrymen who had already rushed past the battle line could not make any effective rescue. They tried their best to shoot the arrows, but the number of desolate man soldiers they could kill was extremely limited. With their horrifying close defense power and unimaginable running speed, the battle on the vast grassland, which should have been one-sided or even a massacre between the cavalrymen and the infantry, was developing in an incredible direction. In fact, since the desolate man tribe moved south and began to fight with the Lieutenant Khan's tribe, this scene, which was completely against the grassland cavalrymen's fighting philosophy, had been playing out. The most terrible thing in a battle was not failure, but when you found that the ideas you had learned in the past battles and the most effective fighting methods suddenly became ineffective. This kind of mental blow could directly make people lose their confidence in fighting. In the previous battles, the grassland cavalrymen had suffered a crushing defeat because of this inexplicable mental panic. Every time they launched a seemingly foolproof charge, they found that the charge did not have any effect. Instead, they became the targets of those thin desolate men. No matter how strong the troops were and how strict the battlefield discipline was, they could not stop the subsequent collapse. According to the process of the previous battles, the grassland cavalrymen should have had a nervous breakdown at this time, and then they would withdraw from the battlefield in a panic. Then they would gather again to rest and recover their spirit and physical strength, and wait for the next charge. Then they would collapse and fail again. But today's situation was obviously a little different. The cavalrymen who were surrounded by the desolate man soldiers on foot did not collapse. They had long been mentally prepared for the outcome of death, so they burst out with extremely fearless courage and desperately waved the machetes in their hands before dying. Although they could not avoid falling under the long machetes of the desolate man soldiers in the end, the desolate man soldiers often had to pay a higher price to kill a grassland cavalryman than the previous times. Around the central battlefield where the blood waves were dense, the grassland cavalrymen who were supposed to support their trapped comrades did not hesitate to lift the reins and leave after hearing a low horn. They did not care that their companions were falling under the siege of the desolate man soldiers. Instead, they divided into two teams at the fastest speed and left the central battlefield in the east and west direction. The huge waves that were crashing against the reef suddenly split into two, leaving only the remnant waves in the middle that were still stuck to the black reef. And behind the fork where the two teams of grassland cavalrymen separated, a gorgeous carriage came slowly. The carriage was decorated with gold and silver and looked extremely gorgeous. In the middle of the carriage was a round plate made of refined steel. The lines on the plate were so dense that they seemed to be even more complicated than the hundreds of millions of stars in the night sky. On both sides of the metal plate stood two expressionless grassland brawny men who were wearing heavy metal armors and holding heavy and sharp machetes in their hands. The countries of the Central Plains strictly controlled the output of salt and iron. It was extremely rare to see full metal heavy armors on the grassland here. The soldiers who were qualified to wear heavy armors must be the bravest and most powerful warriors with the highest status in each palace. Today, the task of these two most powerful warriors of the Left Khan's palace of the grassland was not to fight, but to protect the metal plate on the carriage and the person sitting on the plate. There was a skinny old man sitting on the metal plate. They were their most powerful weapons. However, today their weapons suddenly became useless. They could not catch up with the grassland cavalrymen who were wandering around. What was more terrifying was that they could no longer avoid arrows like before, or at least prevent the enemy's arrows from hitting their vital parts. Swoosh swoosh. The palace cavalrymen who had wandered to the periphery of the grassland regrouped as fast as they could. They divided into two groups of more than 1,000 cavalrymen and galloped in opposite directions at high speed. At the same time, they knocked their bows and shot arrows at the desolate man warriors who were surrounded in the middle. With a puff, a sharp arrow shot into the chest of a young desolate man. He frowned in pain and pulled out the arrow from his chest. However, before he could raise the long knife in his hand, a second arrow, a third arrow, and more arrows shot into his body. Finally, the young man slowly knelt on the ground with his eyes wide open, unwilling and painful. His knees sank into the soft ground, and then he fell forward. I adjusted my biological clock so much that I wanted to die. There were 4 blackouts in the afternoon, which made me feel like I wanted to die. I was afraid that there would be another blackout later, so I wrote 3,000 words and updated it first. There will be another chapter later. Also, the monthly ticket will be doubled from the 29th. This, we will talk about it later. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 184. The sky darkened and the grassland turned into a swamp. No matter how strong the desolate man warriors were, they would lose their most important ability once they could not run as fast and long as the wolves by the hot sea. In the eyes of the grassland cavalrymen, they suddenly became immovable targets. No matter how strong their close-range defense was, they would eventually die of blood exhaustion after being shot by countless arrows. Of course, if they wanted to use arrows to kill these tough desolate man warriors, even if they did not dodge, they would still need a terrifying number of arrows. No cavalryman would carry so many arrows in a normal war. However, during the days when the desolate man went south, dozens of tribes in the left king's court had been defeated. The grassland people had learned from their failures and finally decided on today's war strategy. The palace had sent one of the 7 great sorcerers and the elite cavalrymen. How could there be a shortage of arrows? The horses moved like the wind and the arrows fell like rain. The grassland cavalrymen whistled and kicked the horse's abdomen. With their exquisite shooting skills, they accurately pulled their bows and shot arrows. The desolate man warriors who were surrounded in the middle of the swamp-like grassland struggled to pull their legs out of the grass and mud. They struggled to move their legs and trudged to the periphery. However, the second step they took was also stuck in the mud. Coupled with the accurate and terrifying arrows, the desolate man's speed of breaking through the encirclement was extremely slow. One of the most powerful warriors did not care that his body was full of arrows and bravely stepped through the thick mud. When he was less than 20 steps away from the grassland cavalryman, he was shot in the knee and fell in despair with a muffled groan. Suddenly encountering such a strange ambush, the old veteran among the desolate man warriors had long noticed the strange carriage behind the grassland cavalryman and the strange people in it. He guessed that the sudden change in the grassland must have something to do with the carriage. He only heard the old man shout a few words and then a desolate man warrior with extremely thick arms walked over with difficulty and stood in front of him. The desolate man veteran pressed his palm on the back of the warrior and groaned. His face gradually turned pale and an inexplicable huge force passed through his palm into the warrior's body. The desolate warrior's arms became thicker, as if something had entered his body. He forcibly endured the pain from his skin and ignored the blood flowing out from the corner of his eyes. He stared at the carriage in the distance and suddenly let out a beast-like roar. He pulled out a big axe from his waist and threw it in that direction. The sound of the axe tearing through the air rang out. Under the support of the enormous power, the axe was like a bolt of lightning, traversing a distance of several hundred feet in an instant, chopping towards the golden-robed old royal court wizard on the carriage. Seeing the sharp axe whistling towards him, the 2 valiant warriors of the royal court, who had been standing silently by the old magus side, raised the giant shields at their feet at the most crucial moment, blocking in front of the old magus. The tip of the axe violently collided with the giant metal shield, producing a loud and clear clang. The grassland soldiers beside the chariot were so shocked that they covered their ears and knelt on the ground. The gorgeous carriage only shook slightly before returning to normal. In the carriage, the old magus who was sitting on the metal plate was still expressionless. He hurriedly chanted incantations and the wrinkles on his face deepened. The chi of heaven and earth around him entered the metal plate with his incantation and then followed the talisman patterns that were as complicated as star lines into the ground of the grassland. It was then released by another metal plate that the royal court had buried in the ground in front of them, causing the grassland above to become softer and softer. The desolate man's last hope of escaping was dashed. They raised their heavy long knives and desperately tried to break out of the encirclement in the soft mud. There were people who were hit by dozens of arrows and fell down like thorns. The grassland cavalrymen who were shooting arrows around them whistled more and more sharply. Their ferocious faces were filled with the joy of revenge. The wet grass, the bloody mud, and the galloping horses formed a cruel and desperate picture. The grassland suddenly became quiet and spacious. The cruel shooting of arrows was still going on, but other than the buzzing of strings and the sound of arrows piercing through the air, as well as the sharp whistles of the grassland cavalrymen, no other sound could be heard. The desolate man somehow stopped and buried their bodies in the grass as low as possible. They silently defended and no longer tried to break out of the encirclement. Then even the buzzing of strings, the whistling of arrows, and the sharp whistles of the grassland cavalrymen all disappeared. The battlefield that was supposed to be chaotic became extremely quiet. Quiet was actually a relative term. In fact, The reason why all the chaotic sounds disappeared was that the people on the battlefield could only hear one sound. It was the low vibrating sound of a heavy object piercing through the air at high speed. It was definitely not an arrow, but a flying sword used by the people of the Central Plains. It sounded more like a huge stone that was thrown down from the clouds by Haotian and was constantly accelerating. The desolate man soldiers who were buried in the grass raised their heads with difficulty and looked up at the sky. It broke the broken carriage board. There was a loud bang. Dust and blood and meat powder splashed everywhere. Smoke and dust flew everywhere. The luxurious carriage turned into a pile of rubbish. The sharp metal fragments shot dozens of grassland soldiers standing around the carriage and fell to the ground. The foot that broke through the clouds and tore through the air finally stepped on the grassland that the barbarians had occupied for nearly 1,000 years. A middle-aged man in a leather robe stood in the middle of the ruins with a blood-red giant knife on his back. He looked expressionlessly at the grassland barbarians who were stunned like statues. The desolate soldiers who were trapped in the grassland swamp looked at the powerful man in the distance. They finally broke the silence and let out a crazy roar. Some young desolate people were so excited that they even shed tears. Somewhere in the deep mountains in the south, there was a Taoist temple that looked extremely simple. Because it was remote, there were no tourists or believers who came here. Naturally, there were no incense offerings. The Taoists in the temple didn't like incense either. They felt that the smell was extremely vulgar. It was even different from what ordinary Taoist Haotian thought. The Taoists who lived in this old temple didn't even care about incense money. In the depths of the Taoist temple, there were 7 thatched cottages beside a quiet lake. They were different from the simple and even shabby feeling of this Taoist temple. Although the eaves of these 7 cottages were covered with thatch, they gave people an extremely luxurious and solemn feeling. The roots of the thatch were yellow and white like gold and jade. No one knew how many years they had been through, but they were still as fresh as before. In the first cottage, there was a large and thick classic quietly placed on the agarwood table by the window. The cover was as black as coagulated blood. It also looked like a black blood stone that was formed after hundreds of millions of years. There was a word "re" written on it. The classic had been opened. The pen that was full of ink moved slowly and smoothly to the right to write a line. The middle-aged Taoist put down his pen and looked at it for a moment. He nodded with satisfaction. There were 2 words written on the blank paper. That was someone's name. Ning Quebec Ching Fong couldn't read, but he could help condense the ink and leave the words on the paper. After a while, a breeze blew in from outside the window. The pages of the book rustled and kept turning forward. No one knew how many pages had been turned. The classic with the word "re" written on the cover finally flipped to the front from the page with the word "Ning K" written on it. The first page of the classic was completely blank like snow. There were a few names on the second page. Lu Bai's name was at the top. Not far away, one could vaguely see the word June. There was a person's name on the paper that was different from all the other names. It was extremely lonely and yet extremely powerful. It was as if he was not willing to stand together with the powerful people of the Central Plains who were famous and powerful. Because he was the world wayfarer of the Devil's Doctrine. He was the strongest person in the northern wilderness. His name was Tang. When I was designing the night, I told many people that I wanted to write what I thought was cool. Today's foot is what I thought was cool. It's really easy to feel good writing like this. I hope you can feel good too. It's past midnight. Call for recommendation votes. As for the monthly votes, sigh, I will definitely open the chapter tomorrow. When that time comes, everyone will be happy. Just try your best to vote for me when the votes are doubled tomorrow. Good night. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 185. The middle-aged Taoist closed the classics and walked out of the hut slowly with his hands behind his back. He looked at his companion and said, "I didn't expect so many people of the younger generation to be on the hand scroll." The Taoist asked in confusion, "Who's on the hand scroll today?" "Ning Quebec, this name sounds familiar. Is he the scholar of the academy who defeated Longqing?" "Yes. Although he hasn't entered the see-through state, he has already comprehended Tao and is qualified to be on the hand scroll." The Taoist was slightly stunned and then praised, "The headmaster of the academy is really great." "Yes." The first Taoist shook his head and said with mixed emotions, "Although the headmaster of the academy wasn't in Chang, and when he entered the second floor of the academy, he is his student after all. He started to learn talisman Taoism at such a young age. I believe his name will appear on the first few pages of the hand scroll in 10 years. After that, the Taoist said goodbye to his companions and walked along the edge of the quiet lake in front of the thatched cottage. Along the way, he was accompanied by the scenery of the lake, the mountains, and the forest. It didn't take long for him to walk out of the Taoist temple. Facing the cool breeze that blew from the cliff, the Taoist narrowed his eyes and looked at the faintly visible mountain in the distance, as well as the majestic Taoist temples in the mountain. He smiled, and his smile was full of serenity. The simple and old Taoist temple behind him was quiet, as if it was also quietly watching the prosperity and nobility of the world over there. There was an old horizontal board on the Taoist temple, which had been left countless traces by wind and rain. The board said, "Ji Shou." Hundreds of kilometers to the east was the Sea of Storms. After the terrifying hurricane of the 4 seasons came ashore, it passed through the obstruction of the hills and rivers and turned into a light breeze. It was moist and cool, but it did not have any destructive power. Therefore, the summer here was not as stuffy as it was in Chang'an. This country was not large and was not prosperous because of the lack of commercial development. There were not many idlers except for those devout believers who kowtowed and walked around the mountains to worship heaven. However, the dangerous hurricanes turned into light breezes and drizzles here. The mountains were beautiful but not high, the water was gentle but not turbulent, there were fertile plains and forests filled with deers. It was really a place favored by Haotian. Because of the beautiful hills in the west, it was named West Hill. The mountain that could be seen from the Jishou Abbey was called Peach Mountain. Although the peach blossoms on the mountain had been cut down by someone many years ago, thanks to Haotian's favor, the soil was fertile, and the peach blossoms had been in full bloom from early spring to late summer. The peach blossoms planted on the mountain had been in full bloom from early spring to late summer, lush and dazzling. There were several neat and smooth cliff plateaus on the Peach Mountain, as if they were carved out by the divine power of heaven with a giant axe. Numerous Taoist temples of different styles were built on the cliff plateaus, which formed a group of magnificent and solemn temples. They were the divine halls of West Hill. The divine temple was built on the Peach Mountain and was divided into 3 levels. On the upper cliff plateau closest to the sky, there were 4 most spectacular Taoist temples. Among them, the Taoist temple near the cliff edge was built with huge black stones. Its shape was not like ordinary Taoist buildings. It looked at the believers who kowtowed on the mountain road with eternal indifference. The main hall of the Black Taoist temple was extremely spacious and grand. There was a curtain made of pearls and jade hundreds of meters deep. Behind the curtain was a divine throne carved from the black jade of the South Sea. One of the 3 divine priests of the Haotian divine sect, the great divine priest of judgment, usually sat under this divine throne to listen to the reports of his subordinate priests and deal with the affairs of Haotian Taoism. The great divine priest of judgment wore a red divine robe. Today, he did not order his subordinates to lift the bead curtain. Instead, he looked at the curtain expressionlessly, as if he wanted to see all the pearls and jade on it turn into powder. As one of the 3 divine priests of the West Hill Divine Palace, the great divine priest of judgment was in charge of judgment. He was in charge of the most terrible and violent organization in Haotian Taoism. He had the most powerful cultivators in Haotian Taoism. On the surface, he was the most powerful and had the most terrible reputation in the world. For countless years, many heretics had been secretly arrested because of his words, and many remnants of the devil's doctrine had become ghosts in the fire because of his little finger. In the eyes of hundreds of millions of people in the world, the Haotian hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace might not be as terrible as this great divine priest of judgment in a red divine robe. There had even been a rumor that the reason why the great divine priest of judgment did not use the main color of the judicial department was that his robe was bright red instead of pure black, because it was stained with the blood of all his enemies. Such a great divine priest, who was at the peak of the human world and possessed supreme and terrifying authority, when his face was expressionless and his eyes were indifferent, not to mention the bead curtain in front of him would be scared into powder. Even those great sword masters who held swords and walked in the human world without fear of the royal power would be scared to the point that their hearts would break. However, today, the bead curtain in front of the great divine priest of judgment was not broken. The person on the other side of the bead curtain was not scared to kneel on the ground, but still stood calmly. The bead curtain covered the body and face of the person outside the curtain. Only a pair of shoes at the bottom could be seen. The shoes were dark red like blood, embroidered with a few small fish, and the extremely fluffy red skirt hanging down to the knees. It was obviously a woman. The great divine priest of judgment looked away from the corner of the red skirt and slowly raised his head. He asked expressionlessly, "Why hasn't Long Qing come back yet?" The woman outside the curtain replied, "Why hasn't that coward Long Qing come back? How would I know? I have never been in charge of human affairs since I took charge of the judicial department. Why do you ask me, uncle?" The crisp voice sounded clearer through the bead curtain. She should be young and still a young girl. The great divine priest of judgment slightly lowered his eyes and said, "Ning Kei's name appeared on the hand scroll." The girl outside the curtain was silent for a moment and then said with slight sarcasm, "Ning Kei is Long Qing's opponent. If he can't even kill such a little reptile in a no-doubt state, do you still expect me to do it? I will take it as an insult." The light in the eyes of the great divine priest of judgment suddenly shone and then quickly disappeared. He said without emotion, "Long Qing was defeated by this person. Of course, he has to win personally to restore his Taoist heart. But I must remind you that although this person is still in the no-doubt state and is just an inconspicuous reptile in your eyes, he has entered the 2nd floor of the academy and become a student of the headmaster of academy. Even if you pay attention to him in advance, it is not an insult. Learning talisman Taoism from Uncle Yen Sei does not necessarily mean that he can become the second Uncle Yen Sei. I think at least now he is not qualified to be worthy of my attention." The girl in red outside the curtain proudly said, "Uncle, you should be very clear that my goal has always been Jun Mo. Others are not qualified to distract me. Jun Mo, the second disciple of the academy." The great divine priest of judgment softly sighed with a trace of sarcasm on his old face. No one knew whether he was mocking the girl outside the curtain or other ignorant people. "A few years ago, the hierarch lord took you back to the ceremony. You had the opportunity to see the hand scroll. After you saw the name of Jun Mo, you have been unable to calm down. Because you can't imagine how there can be such a cultivation genius in the world that far surpasses you, so you always want to surpass this enemy you have never met." The great divine priest of judgment looked at the girl in red outside the curtain and said indifferently, "You said that others are not qualified to distract you, but have you ever thought about this? Even I and your brother dare not say that they will win Jun Mo. What qualifications do you have to be his opponent? How can you exist in the eyes of the incomparably proud second brother of the academy?" As the voice fell, a gust of wind blew from somewhere in the Peach Mountain, passing through the empty and magnificent hall. The bead curtain in the depths of the hall gently swayed and made a crisp sound. Outside the swaying bead curtain, the lace on the girl's red dress could be vaguely seen rising in the wind. The most powerful priest under his command was angry because of being despised, but the great divine priest of judgment seemed not to notice it. He continued expressionlessly, "Recently, the situation in the wilderness seems to be a bit unstable. The desolate men continue to move south. I don't know where they will step in the end. The hierarch lord is worried that the remnants of the devil's doctrine will take advantage of the situation to rise again. The sign on the tomes of Arcane is about to be issued. The judicial department will naturally go first. You immediately set off for the north." The girl in red outside the curtain was obviously a little surprised. After a moment of silence, she said, "After all, it is just a small matter. I am anxious to cultivate in the mountain and break the realm. Uncle, please choose another candidate." The great divine priest of judgment calmly looked at the girl's figure outside the curtain and said, "The divine hall recognizes your talent and perseverance in cultivation. So when you deliberately angered Chinpipi to leave the West Hill and your brother wanted to kill you with his sword, the hierarch lord and I saved you at all costs. But you need to know that talent and perseverance are not absolute guarantees of pride. Your brother is proud and calm. Jun Mo is proud and dull. That is because they have long stood at the peak of the young generation in the world. They have the strength to be proud. Whether it is you or Long Qin, although you are good enough, you are not in that absolutely powerful field. As long as someone is sure to defeat you, you have no right to be proud. Because this kind of pride without absolute guarantee of strength will be a great obstacle to the cultivation of your Taoist heart. Absolutely believe that what you believe is right. Faith can be firm. Absolutely believe that no one can defeat you. Pride can be firm. People like your brother and Jun Mo had already achieved this many years ago, but what about you guys? In the legends of the world, the two priests of the judicial department are great figures. But in fact, what is so great about you? Long Qin went to the academy in Chang'an this time, but he was defeated by a young man in the no-doubt state. I believe he will understand something. It is a pity that you have never had a chance to be defeated under the love of the hierarch and me. The girl outside the curtain was silent for a long time and then asked, "Uncle, Master, and you decided to let me go to the wilderness. Do you want me to deliberately seek defeat?" The great divine priest of judgment said indifferently, "The headmaster of the academy once said that you can only get benevolence if you seek benevolence. As for failure, seeking defeat often means not being defeated. So I want you to seek defeat in the hope that you will really not be defeated in the future." The girl outside the curtain bowed and then turned to leave. A priest of the judicial department came in from the side door of the main hall. He looked at the girl who was stepping on the bright golden beads and walking out of the hall. He looked at the red dress swaying in the wind and could not help but shake his head. He walked behind the bead curtain and bowed respectfully to the great divine priest of judgment on the throne. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Everyone in the West Hill Divine Palace knew that the brother of the girl in red must be the next hierarch of Hautian Taoism, and she was very likely to become the next great divine priest of judgment. So this subordinate who was loyal to the great divine priest of judgment always felt that the previous reprimand of the great divine priest of judgment was too harsh. The great divine priest of judgment knew what this subordinate was thinking and said expressionlessly, "The hierarch and I let her go to the wilderness to give her a chance to see how big the world is. The world praises her as the Tao addict, and she is indeed a bit obsessed. I think she will not have any opinion on things that are good for cultivation. Give me 3,000 first. There are still some left. I am writing. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 186. Hearing this, the priest guessed that the hierarch and the great divine priest must have communicated with that person about this arrangement. So he did not say anything more. He took out the file and turned it to a certain page. He asked, "The U prison is almost full." The U prison was a place where the judicial department of the Divine Hall was responsible for detaining criminals. It was located deep underground at the back of Peach Mountain and never saw the sun. For thousands of years, countless powerhouses of the devil's doctrine and rebellious people who went against the doctrine of Haotian had been imprisoned here. They were either executed or locked up. The great divine priest of judgment supported his chin with his hand. No one knew what he was thinking about. Hearing this, his slender jade-like right hand slowly tilted up and said, "As usual." The judicial department's solution to the overcrowding of the U prison was very simple. That was to kill a group of people and burn a group of corpses. The corpses that occupied the space would be turned into ashes and dissolved in water to nourish the peach blossoms. There would be no waste. The subordinate priest nodded without any unnatural expression. Obviously, there was no psychological barrier. The great divine priest of judgment suddenly closed his eyes slowly and asked in a low voice, "How is the great divine priest of light now?" The subordinate priest heard the words, "Great divine priest of light," and his body suddenly stiffened. He bowed his head and replied, "He is the same as before, chanting the doctrines and classics every day. It seems, there is nothing unusual." The great divine priest of judgment closed his eyes and thought for a long time. His right index finger gently tapped on the armrest of the black jade throne. Suddenly he opened his eyes and said emotionlessly, "Let the whole world know that the 13th disciple of the academy, Ning Ke, has entered the hand scroll." The priest looked at the old face of the great divine priest and asked carefully after a moment of silence, "Dear great divine priest, what is the purpose of releasing this news?" The great divine priest of judgment did not explain and continued indifferently, "In addition, let everyone know that Ning Ke, besides Chao Xiaoshu, killed the monk Wuxia of Yueluan Kingdom and the swordsman of South Jin Kingdom in one night at Spring Breeze Pavilion in Chang'an last year." The priest vaguely guessed the intention of such an arrangement. He thought for a moment and whispered, "Even if the aunt of Yueluan Kingdom and the sword Garrett are angry, Ning Ke is a student of the headmaster of academy and he is in the Tang Empire. Who dares to take revenge? Even if he is out of the Tang Empire, will Kuni Madi and the sword Garrett dare to take revenge?" After the Spring Breeze Pavilion incident, the Yueluan Kingdom and the sword Garrett did not dare to make a sound, because they knew that they were involved in the internal politics of the Tang Empire and were afraid of being implicated by the Tang Emperor's anger. How could they dare to take revenge? But hatred is always easy to stimulate some hot blood, especially in the face of a young man who is still in no doubt state. Even if you dare not kill him, it is also good to humiliate him a few times. The priest did not understand. Even if the Yueluan Kingdom and the sword Garrett found an opportunity to humiliate Ning Ke, what was the point? The great divine priest of judgment closed his eyes again and began to rest. He did not explain. Chang'an City, Lin 47th Street, behind the old brush pen shop. Early in the morning, Sang Sang carried a bucket and was about to water the plants when she heard a voice behind her, "Leave it to me." After a long time, a messily drawn talisman paper fell from the window and stayed in the basin for a long time. It slowly turned into wet water and gradually seeped into the soil to nourish the roots of the flower. In the evening, Sang Sang squatted in front of the stove and was about to start the fire to steam the rice when she heard a voice behind her, "Leave it to me." After a long time, a light yellow talisman paper was stuffed into the stove hole by a hand and instantly turned into a flame. It was extremely difficult to ignite the dry wood in the stove hole, and then with the help of Sang Sang's puffed cheeks, it turned into a raging fire. Late at night, Sang Sang squatted in front of the bed and was about to wipe the bamboo mat to cool it when she heard a voice behind her, "Leave it to me." After a long time, a piece of talisman paper was rolled into a ball and thrown into the basin. It was gradually soaked until it became soft and dispersed. After a long time, a very thin layer of ice floated on the water surface. Sang Sang squatted beside the basin and stared at the water surface with her willow-like eyes until her eyes hurt. Then she rubbed her eyes and stood up. She wet the towel in the water and tightly pursed her lips. Without saying a word, she began to wipe the bamboo mat on the bed and turned to pour water after wiping it. At this moment, she heard another voice behind her, "Leave it to me." Sang Sang couldn't stand it anymore. She threw the wet towel into the basin and turned around with her hands on her thin waist. She angrily stared at the desk with her bright willow-like eyes and seriously said, "Young master. Do you know how long it takes me to wait for your talisman paper to work? Do you know that such a long time is enough for me to water the flowers, light the firewood, cook the rice, wipe the bed, and then rest? When we were in the city of Wei, you once told me that delaying other people's time is killing lives. Then why do you always want to kill me?" Next to the desk, Ning Kei was holding a brush and was eager to continue writing talismans. Suddenly hearing such a long accusation, the excitement on his face turned into a bit of resentment. He awkwardly said, "I just learned to write talismans. I'm a little excited and always want to practice more. Why do you take it so seriously?" After understanding talisman Taoism in that summer rainstorm, Ning Kei was immersed in that magical world and couldn't extricate himself. From waking up in the morning to going to bed, he wrote talismans in the small courtyard, which made it difficult for Sang Sang to do housework. He also kept writing talismans in the back of the mountain of the academy. The senior brothers and sisters who were cultivating in seclusion now had to worry about the flying swords, arrows, and needles. They also had to worry about the fresh water rushing into their faces and the soil ridge suddenly appearing under their feet. What was more terrible was the fire that the talisman paper turned into. Now a saying began to spread in the back of the mountain of the academy: "Guard against fire, knives, and junior brothers." The unhappy senior brothers and sisters finally made a not difficult decision. If youngest brother wanted to write talismans, he had to do it in the blacksmith room of sixth brother. Anyway, there was fire all year round, so they didn't worry about a fire. Ning Kei felt that the senior brothers and sisters were making a fuss over a trifle. It was nothing to be splashed with some water and burned a few holes in the academy uniforms. They were all powerful cultivators, at least in the see-through state. How could they be afraid of these? But since he had offended the public, he had to stay in the sixth brother's room obediently every day. Accompanied by the sixth brother's simple and honest sigh and the fourth brother's angry roar, he kept practicing talisman. Presently, he was like a child that had obtained a new toy, and he played tirelessly from morning to night as if he would never feel tired or tired. Along with the passage of time, he mastered more and more talisman techniques, and his understanding of the Tao of talismans grew deeper and deeper. He didn't know that shortly after he condensed the first drop of water on the tip of his brush on that rainy summer night, his name appeared on the first volume of the 7 tomes of Arcane in the unknown place in the deep mountains of the West Hill Divine Kingdom. He also didn't know that the great divine priest of judgment in the West Hill Divine Palace, for some inexplicable reason, decided to announce his name in front of hundreds of millions of believers in the world. In fact, Ning Kei's reputation, at least in Chang'an, was loud enough without the help of the West Hill Divine Palace. The back mountain of the academy was hidden in the fog. Ordinary people didn't know the details, but His Majesty's appreciation and love for him shocked many people. Moreover, the fight between Grand Secretary Wang and Old Chancellor Jin had lasted for decades. In the 14th year of Tianqi era, it finally developed to a white-hot level because of several calligraphy sections. Between the two mansions, from the masters to the lowest servants, there would be a fight every few days. Indirectly, his deeds began to spread in the streets and alleys of Chang'an. Last year by the lake, a golden boy and a jade girl snuggled up to each other in the wind. I don't know how many people envied them. Miss Gao looked over there and almost cried. But now, Xie Qingyun clearly knew that Jin Wuxia was the most suitable candidate for a wife, but he couldn't overcome the difficulty of face. He returned to the South Jin Kingdom with a gloomy face and continued to be a young master of an aristocratic family and a minister in the future, leaving Jin Wuxia alone in Chang'an. Tut tut. Young master, why do I feel that you are a little envious and jealous? Why should I be envious? I told you last year outside the princess mansion that I don't understand love, but I know that people who play with love, especially young people, are all idiots. But there are always men and women in the world. Men and women should do the things between men and women, but never misunderstand it as love. What is the thing between men and women? Well, most people who come to the House of Red Sleeves do it. Ning Kai and Sang Sang got off the carriage and walked to the House of Red Sleeves while chatting. They often came to the House of Red Sleeves and were very familiar with the place. They naturally passed through the side door, went around to the side of the building and entered the main hall. He deliberately chose to come in the morning because there was no business in the House of Red Sleeves at this time. However, he did not expect that when he entered the main hall, the girls who were supposed to be wearing ordinary home clothes, wandering around while yawning, and then seeing him, their eyes would light up, rush over to pinch his cheeks, and take him to the backyard to play, seemed to have changed into a different group of people. He saw that the girls were dressed very formally, wearing expensive clothes that were only worn on important occasions. They were divided into two lines in the hall and looked at him with a smile but a bit reserved, as if they had specially come to welcome him. When they saw Ning Kai coming out from the side door with Sang Sang, they bowed very neatly and said in a clear voice, "Greetings, Mr. Ning." Looking at this scene and hearing the clear voice, Ning Kai couldn't help but be dumbfounded. He looked at Dewdrop who stood at the front of the line and asked, "Sister Dewdrop, what are you doing?" These days, Dewdrop had earned a lot of money by selling chicken soup stickers and rubbings of the Yen family. She often wanted to exchange money with Sang Sang, but she was not as friendly as other girls. She greeted him with a smile, held his arm and led him inside, and explained softly, "Now your identity and status are different. Who would dare to tease you like before? Mistress Jian knew that you died after entering the second floor and the whole building was full of red envelopes. The girls in the building are in awe of your current glory and also happy about the benefits you have brought. It's the first time for you to come back after a few months, so of course everyone should welcome you." Although Ning Kai was busy with cultivation after entering the second floor of the academy and seldom contacted the outside world, he had attended several banquets these days and probably knew that he could be regarded as a celebrity in Chang'an City. However, he really did not expect that he could receive such treatment in the House of Red Sleeves and could not help but feel a little intoxicated. Unfortunately, he didn't have much time to think about it. Just when the maidens had finally digested the shock and fear in their hearts and were about to pounce on him and ask him about the rumors, Mistress Jian's personal maidservant, Xiao Chao, came down the stairs with a cold expression and reiterated Mistress Jian's rules to everyone. Sang Sang and Xiao Chao, who was about the same age and familiar with each other, went to the back garden to play. Ning Kai sighed and struggled to climb to the top floor of the House of Red Sleeves with his legs filled with lead. He reluctantly pushed open the wooden door and lifted the bead curtain. He bowed deeply to the woman behind the curtain and complained, "I have already entered the second floor of the academy. Why can't I?" Mistress Jian, who had a broad forehead and a straight nose, was not a traditional beauty but had a kind of grace similar to that of a man. She smiled slightly and gestured Ning Kai to sit down. She said, "How old are you? Why are you always thinking about men and women?" Ning Kai was annoyed and said, "The more you don't want to do something, the more you want to do it. Besides, I am already 18 years old. Last time I said, you can call me Aunt Jian." Mistress Jian pushed the tea in front of him and said with a smile, "No matter how much His Majesty appreciates you and how those guys in the back mountain love you, as long as I don't agree, no brothel in the entire Chang'an city dares to provoke you." "My dear aunt," Ning Kai said helplessly, "why is that?" Mistress Jian said earnestly, what kind of place is the academy and what kind of place is the second floor? Since you are so lucky to enter, of course you should put all your attention on learning and cultivation. Why bother to entangle yourself with brothels like us? If something bad really happens, it's okay for you, but what if the reputation of the academy is damaged? I think even the headmaster of the academy doesn't care about these things. Ning Ke said. Mistress Jian raised her eyebrows and said in a low voice, even if the headmaster of the academy says something, he has to get my approval. Ning Ke entered the House of Red Sleeves by mistake when he came to Chang'an City at the beginning of last year. From the first time they met, Mistress Jian had cared about him like an elder. To be honest, he had been a little puzzled about this, especially when Mistress Jian seemed to be very familiar with the academy when she talked. Moreover, when he heard what she said at this time, he was even more puzzled. After a moment, he tentatively asked, Aunt Jian, are you familiar with the academy? Hearing this, Mistress Jian was slightly startled. She picked up the tea on the table as a cover and answered after a moment of silence, I have never been to the academy. Never been to the academy did not mean that she was not familiar with the academy. Ning Ke was about to continue asking but did not expect Mistress Jian to directly ask, is Jun Mo still so old-fashioned? Jun Mo. Ning Ke was confused. Mistress Jian looked at him and frowned, he's your second brother. You don't even know his name. Ning Ke was a little surprised and tentatively said, how dare I call him by his name? You know how proud he is, so you forgot what second brother's name is. Proud? Mistress Jian seemed to recall something and a look of reminiscence appeared on her face. She smiled and said, since he entered the mountain, Xiao Mo likes to pretend to be proud and even made a stick to his head. Ning Ke burst into laughter. Mistress Jian smiled and shook her head. She suddenly asked, how is that scholar? The scholar is still studying. Everyone is still fine. Aunt Jian, why don't you ask the headmaster of the academy and eldest brother? Have they come back? No. If not, then what's the point of asking since you haven't seen them? But I believe that the headmaster of the academy and your eldest brother will be fine no matter where they are. Mistress Jian's voice gradually lowered. Her thoughts drifted back to many years ago, and her eyes were slightly moist. Ning Ke vaguely understood something. The reason why the leader of the world of romance treated him so favorably after knowing that he was a student of the academy must be because of some empathy in the past. But who was the person who had a relationship with her in the past? Who in the back mountain looked like him? Second brother. Xiao Mo. Or the sixth brother who had a body of strong muscles and was very popular with women? Could it be the headmaster of the academy? Ning Ke came to the small courtyard of Dewdrop in the back garden. He finished writing calligraphy for Lu Shui and a few familiar girls and stamped them with his private seal. Finally, he sent the satisfied girls out. He did not think about the relationship between Mistress Jian and the academy anymore. He smiled and walked to Dewdrop. His eyes fell on her snow-white soft breasts, and his mind could not help but shake. Dewdrop looked shy and hurriedly waved her hands and stepped back. She hurriedly said, don't do this, don't do this. Ning Ke was stunned. He thought that although they had never been intimate, they had hugged, pinched, and touched many times. Why did Sister Zhu have such a big reaction today? He felt like he was a pervert who was approaching her step by step. Suddenly, his eyes brightened. He thought that this was probably the legendary situational acting. It was very interesting to try to resist. I forced you to step back, and you retreated behind the curtain with shame. Then the red candles would make waves. He laughed and said, my good sister, no one can hear you even if you shout yourself hoarse. Dewdrop's face turned slightly pale. She repeatedly pushed him away and said sadly, my good brother, I really can't. Ning Ke found something wrong and asked confusedly, why not? Mistress Jian has said it, we agreed last time to come secretly and ignore her. But, your master spent the night here last night. Master? Master Yen Sei, Dewdrop was extremely ashamed. She held the silk scarf and looked at him timidly. She said, although I work in the brothel, there are still some things that I can't do. If it is spread out that I serve my master and then serve my disciple, how can I be a man? In today's world, the relationship between master and disciple was even more powerful than that between father and son. Dewdrop was the most popular girl in Chang'an City. She was extremely picky when she received guests. Most of the time, she made tea, surrounded some light food, and seduced others to earn money. There were only a few guests who could really enter her tent in the past 2 years. How could she serve the master and disciple? Ning Ke was stunned for a long time. Then he said angrily, Master can touch, but can't a student touch? Ning Ke was not lustful. He was just in the prime of his youth at the age of 18. His body was burning hot. He had never been in contact with a woman in his previous lives, not to mention that he yearned for sex when he was full and warm. Now he had countless silver notes under his bed and was enjoying a good time in the cultivation world. Of course, he would be particularly curious and yearning for the affairs between men and women in his spare time. When he returned to the old brush pen shop at night, he lay on the bed. The stuffy summer night in Chang'an City and the heat in his body attacked him from both inside and outside, making him toss and turn and unable to fall asleep. On the contrary, the hot summer in Chang'an City was the most comfortable season for Sang Sang, who was born with a weak constitution. She had already fallen into a deep sleep at the head of the bed. The little handmaiden was sleeping very soundly. She turned over in her sleep, bent her right leg, and heavily hit the lower part of Ning Ke's abdomen. Ning Ke was suddenly hit hard and groaned in pain. His body bent like a cooked shrimp and his face turned pale. After a while, the pain gradually subsided. He angrily glared at Sang Sang, who was still sleeping soundly, and reached out to pull her leg down. When his fingers touched Sang Sang's small foot, he suddenly felt a very comfortable coldness. It was very good to touch. It was like the smooth and cool ice fish in the wine cup at the Grand Secretary's mansion a few days ago. It felt really comfortable to hold such a small foot in his hand on such a hot summer night. Ning Ke was a little reluctant to let go of it. He held it in his hand and gently touched it. With the starlight coming through the window, he saw that the small foot in his hand was as white as jade and as beautiful as a lotus carved from ice jade. Ning Ke held the cold foot and frowned slightly. No one knew what was going on in his mind. Sang Sang probably felt a little itchy when his fingers touched the sole of the foot. She shrunk her foot in her sleep, but failed to pull her foot out of Ning Ke's hand and woke up. She rubbed her sleepy eyes and asked, "Young master, why did you grab my foot?" Ning Ke was shocked and felt that he had suddenly become a poor boy who was beaten by many women outside the women's bathhouse with washing boards. He forcibly suppressed his embarrassment and explained in a trembling voice, "It's too hot. Your foot is cold and comfortable to hold." Hearing the explanation, Sang Sang replied with an "oh," and lay down again to sleep. She adjusted her body and leaned to the right side so that Ning Ke could hold her right foot more easily. The backyard of the old brush pen shop returned to silence. Only the faint sound of cicadas could be heard from the street. After some time, Ning Ke suddenly asked, "Sang Sang, how old are you this year?" Sang Sang closed her eyes and answered, "I don't know when I was born. You told me that I was not that old when you picked me up. So I should be almost 14 now." 14, Ning Ke silently repeated in his heart and then let go of her foot in his hand. He said, "Sleep well." Sang Sang opened her eyes and looked at him curiously. She asked, "Young master, didn't you find it hot? I'll get a palm leaf fan." "What's the use of a palm leaf fan? Can't your feet stink?" "I wash my feet every day." But young master, your feet really stink. I don't care. Anyway, I'm going to get a palm leaf fan. Young master. Yes. Let me do it. A rustling sound came from the other side of the bed. Sang Sang crawled over and lay down beside Ning Quebec. She stretched out her slender arms and legs to hug him and put her face on his chest to find a comfortable position. Then she rubbed her face against his chest. She snuggled in his arms and murmured sleepily, "It's cool now." Her body was still small and thin. She hugged Ning Kei's legs and wrapped them around his waist, looking like a silk thread on an oak tree. However, she was a girl who was about to turn 14. The cool and bouncy feeling came through the thin layer of clothing. Ning Kei opened his eyes and looked at the roof. Although he was hugging her, he felt hotter and couldn't fall asleep. The cicada on the green tree in the street also couldn't sleep. She kept complaining about the heat. Well written, so I need a monthly vote. The double monthly vote has started. I can't do it alone. Please vote a few more. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 187. The next day, Sang Sang went to the house of Red Sleeves again. She called Xiao Qiao downstairs and walked to a secluded place in the back garden. She looked at Xiao Qiao and wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Her slender fingers kept twisting the hem of her clothes and she looked extremely nervous. Why are you so mysterious? Xiao Qiao looked at her and asked, what happened? Sang Sang hesitated for a long time and said in a low voice, last night, young master suddenly asked me how old I am. Xiao Qiao rubbed her head in confusion and asked, and then? Nothing. Sang Sang shook her head and thought for a long time with her brows furrowed. Then she continued, I always feel that young master is a little strange now. A few days ago, he often said that I have no emotional appeal. Xiao Qiao gasped and stared at Sang Sang's dark face and skinny body with her round eyes. She said in disbelief, you're so dark and skinny, and you're so young. How could he not let you go? What a beast. At the back of the mountain of the academy, Ning Kei pushed open the fence and walked into the small courtyard, listening to the roar of the waterfall falling into the clear pond. He vigilantly waved away the big white goose and looked at second brother who came out. He could not help but frown. He thought that Mistress Jian called second brother like that yesterday. Did he really do something worse than a beast to Mistress Jian? Second brother handed several books to him and said, I found some old books on engraving talismans for weapons and armors in the cliff cave the other day. Thinking that you have been keen on engraving talismans on weapons recently, I asked you to come and have a look. Ning Kei took the books to express his gratitude but did not leave immediately. He looked at second brother's face and wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. After a long time of hesitation, he could not help but tentatively ask, second brother, has anyone ever called you Little Momo? Second senior brother, who was serious, upright, and very particular about manners, could not be associated with a name like Little Momo no matter how one imagined it. When Ning Kei plucked up the courage to say it, he was ready to be beaten by second brother with the academy's rules. However, he did not expect that second brother was not angry when he heard the words, Little Momo. Instead, his body suddenly stiffened and he looked a little dazed, as if he was recalling something. After a long time, second brother stared into his eyes and asked in a deep voice, have you seen Aunt Jian? Looking at second brother's expression, it was obvious that he was acquainted with Mistress Jian. Ning Kei cheered in his heart and thought to himself, will I really dig out the truth hidden behind the dark history of the academy? Don't think too much. The second brother frowned and said, Aunt Jian used to be familiar with youngest uncle. She is his elder. Ning Ke was slightly stunned. He did not expect that the truth did not match with the answers he had guessed. This was the second time he had heard of youngest uncle in the back of the mountain of the academy. Whether it was Chen Pippi before or second brother at this time, they all looked extremely serious and respectful when they mentioned youngest uncle. It could be imagined how powerful the person who could make second brother and Chen Pippi, who were such proud geniuses, admire him from the bottom of their hearts. Ning Ke really wanted to know how amazing the youngest uncle, whom he had never met before, was. Senior brother, what kind of person is junior martial uncle? Little martial uncle, is a very amazing person. More powerful than the headmaster. That's a different kind of greatness. Where is junior martial uncle now? He's dead. The story of youngest uncle might not have a good ending, so second brother did not tell Ning Ke too much about the past except for a few simple words of introduction. Ning Ke naturally felt a little regretful, but he could not hold second brother's thigh and say, "Tell me, tell me, tell me," like Sang Sang who pestered him to tell stories when he was a child. Leaving the small courtyard, Ning Ke walked to the middle of the cliff yard along the opposite direction of the waterfall. When he came to a green tree, Ning Ke felt a little hot and dry. He took out a very small fu paper from his sleeve, clapped his hands gently, and then turned it up. The fu paper could not be seen in his palms, only half a handful of water could be seen. He used the clear water in his hand to wash his face. Facing the cool breeze beside the tree, his slightly wet cheeks felt refreshed. He sighed in satisfaction, then helplessly sighed again. He shook his head and muttered to himself, "Handsome is handsome. It's more than enough to be a magician to amuse women. However, if it's used for fighting, it doesn't seem to be of much use." As a divine talisman master, Master Yen Sei certainly had a good insight. Ning Ke's potential or aptitude in talisman Taoism was really rare in the world. These days, he was immersed in the world of Fu characters, and the speed of his progress was amazing. He just began to understand Tao on that rainy night, and now he had mastered more than 200 effective Fu characters. Unfortunately, the casting speed of talisman Taoism was too slow, and it was too difficult to rely on it to fight. What's more, Ning Ke's own cultivation state was too low, and he was still wandering in the no-doubt state. If he relied on throwing Fu paper to fight the enemy, his body might be cut into hundreds of pieces by flying swords. The Fu paper in his hands was just the beginning. He even carefully evaluated that if he fought with talisman Taoism, it was not as solid as carrying the 3 knives on his back. What Master Yen Sei had said unintentionally, he had always remembered it very clearly. In the real-time battle, a talisman master must rely on infinitive Fu to faintly suppress a cultivator in the same state. However, only a divine talisman master could draw infinitive Fu. 10 years later, a divine talisman master. What should he do if he met an enemy within 10 years? Although after entering the see-through state, talisman Taoism would definitely play a more powerful role in the battle, it could only play an auxiliary role after all. Ning Ke had been fighting all his life, fighting to survive, fighting to wash the blood on his hands. So now he was living a good life in the academy in Chang and every day, but he still did not forget to be vigilant in times of peace. The hard days had shaped his blues nature under the hip-hop appearance. Countless tests at the critical moment of life and death made him accustomed to always guarding against the arrows shooting from the back and the possible dangers in the future. If Xia Ho is standing on the other side of the tree now, what can you do? Ning Ke looked at the big green tree and asked himself very seriously. Then he fell into a long silence, thinking about the combination of talisman Taoism and martial arts, looking for a way to strengthen his own combat power. After a long time, he finally stopped thinking and walked up along the flat stone path on the right side of the big green tree. Following the steam and the smell of the stove, he walked into the iron-making room of sixth brother. After entering the room today, he did not immediately lift the heavy iron hammer to help sixth brother. Instead, he walked to a dark corner, came to fourth brother, bowed down and said a few words. Fourth senior brother frowned slightly and nodded. He stood up and led him out of the house. Behind the house was the clear stream. Fat and colorful koi were swimming slowly in the water, almost motionless, as if they were jade fish statues frozen in the stream. The sky in the academy was sunny, and the fish in the academy were happy. Although they had to be on guard against the sudden attack of those birds, at least they did not have to work hard to look for food. Every day at a fixed time, a big white goose would come to feed them. The old fish naturally became fat and lazy after being cooked for a long time. The water wheel squeaked and turned, constantly drawing the stream water into the bamboo pipe and then sending it to the iron-making room. The two sat by the stream not far from the water wheel. The bamboo forest blocked the sun above their heads, and it was cool all around them. Fourth brother took out a pile of fine carving knives, ruler lines and pigments from the bag, picked up a round stone from the stream, and began to carve on it with a carving knife. Ning-Kei imitated him, picked up a round stone, and carefully drew on it with a water-resistant pigment pen. As the tip of the pen moved, several complex lines appeared on the stone. Suddenly, he felt a little tricky and did not know how to continue. He could not help but look up at the stone in fourth brother's arms. Senior brother, is there something wrong with the line you drew? How can the wind talisman be carved so wide? Fourth brother said without raising his head, the stone is too heavy. If you want to borrow the breath of wind to float the stone, of course, you need more lines, deeper and wider, to stimulate more breath of wind. Ning-Kei looked at the stone in his arms and stared at the lines on the stone, frowning and saying, but the deeper and wider the lines are, the faster the breath of wind condensed in the talisman lines will leak. How to solve this problem? Fourth brother raised his head and asked after a long silence, what do you think? Ning-Kei hesitated and said, how about, using the wood talisman as a bridge to limit myself? If I limit myself, how to condense the breath of wind of heaven and earth in the talisman? Open a small aperture. Open a small aperture. After condensing the breath, it will be completely sealed. When it is stimulated, the aperture of the wood talisman will open by itself. It seems feasible. Then shall we try? There's no harm in trying. Beside the clear stream, the water wheel turned its head with a squeak, and the rhythmic sound of iron being hammered in the room behind the stream rang out. Among these sounds, Ning-Kei and fourth brother were discussing in a low voice. This scene was really calming. After a long time, the talisman on the round stone in fourth brother's arms was first carved. Then, Ning-Kei also finished his work. They looked at each other and put the stone on the flat ground beside the stream. They slowly closed their eyes and began to feel and touch the talisman they carved on the stone. They saw a gust of wind on the two round stones beside the stream, and the ants and bamboo leaves under the stones rustled. However, the stones were still sitting quietly by the stream, like lazy and fat koi in the stream, hiding in the shadow under the water wheel leaves and refused to move at all. Ning-Kei and fourth brother opened their eyes almost at the same time. They stared at each other, dumbfounded. Wishful thinking. Fourth brother sighed and said, to make a heavy object soar into the air, it needs countless talismans to form a tactical array. You want to achieve the same effect with such a small talisman. It's really, wishful thinking. Ning-Kei regretfully said, I thought there would always be some miracles since there are so many idiots in our academy. But this way is not necessarily impossible. Fourth brother threw the stone into the stream and motioned Ning-Kei to do the same. With two splashes, the water splashed in all directions. The fat fishes that were either eating or sleeping were so scared that they fled in all directions. Finally, the precious training time had arrived. The stream under the shadow of the water wheel's leaves suddenly became empty. Try again. Fourth brother said to Ning-Quebec. Ning-Kei stood by the stream and looked at the round stone at the bottom of the shallow stream. He looked at the indistinct lines on the stone and took a deep breath. His eyes slightly drooped and his hands that were exposed outside his sleeves formed a bridge. The psyche power in his sense of perception integrated into the breath of heaven and earth around him, and he could clearly feel the round stone in the stream. The shallow stream suddenly rippled slightly, and there seemed to be a very thin airflow splashing around the round stone at the bottom of the stream, disturbing the water grass gently swaying. Then the round stone slightly trembled, as if it was going to walk. Let's rush to update one chapter first. There is still one more chapter. Today I was outside making the cart, and my fingers are cold. I am not in good spirits, so I write slowly and roughly. There are probably many chapters that haven't been revised. I will fix them together after I finish this period. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chijien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 188. The round stones at the bottom of the shallow stream trembled slightly, as if they wanted to leave, but they didn't move at all. They only struggled to make some small whirlpools, and then rose up, passing through the dense water plants, bringing along the air bubbles attached to the bottom of the grass. This proves that the talisman is effective, but the effect is too weak, so it can only be displayed with the buoyancy of the stream. Fourth brother looked at the pearl-like air bubbles in the stream and asked indifferently, "Youngest brother, I appreciate your idea that you are willing to use your talisman Taoism in practical things instead of metaphysics. But I don't understand why you want the talisman to be so small. Where are you going to use it?" Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, "I'm going to carve this talisman on the arrow, so it must be small." Fourth brother turned back and looked at him quietly, saying, "Good idea." Ning Ke smiled, but he heard fourth brother's next words before his smile was fully stretched. "Unfortunately, it's still wishful thinking." He asked in surprise, "Why?" Fourth brother said, "Carving talismans on armors can increase defense, and carving talismans on swords can increase lethality. Has no one ever thought of carving talismans on arrows? Since ancient times, countless people have had this idea, but they all failed." Ning Ke frowned and asked, "Why did they fail?" "There are thousands of reasons, but there is only one real explanation. Because all the attempts to carve talismans on arrows have failed. So at least until today, this is a good idea destined to fail. Failure is the mother of success." Youngest brother's words are very reasonable, but don't forget that many mothers gave birth to children who were also failures. It doesn't matter if I try again, does it? Then you have to redesign the talisman lines. Now your talisman can only be carved on the beam of the Daming Palace. Even if you have the ability to turn the beam of the Daming Palace into an arrow, where can you find such a thick bowstring? Fourth brother, I just found out that you are very mean today. A talisman master like me, who plays technical work, pays particular attention to carving on the thinnest part. Good answer. It was not Ning Ke's first idea to carve talismans on arrows to increase power and shooting range. As a matter of fact, he already had this idea when he was listening to the old man Liu Qingchen talking about the secrets of cultivation on the grassland last year. Years of training in Min Mountain and the frontier fortress had given him excellent archery skills. Every time he thought about how to fight against strong cultivators, he would naturally think of bows and arrows. If talisman Taoism could be used on feathered arrows, then a safe distance and surprise attack could be guaranteed in a battle with a cultivation powerhouse. When Liu Qingchen heard about this idea last year during the journey, he immediately said that the arrow was too light to carve talismans on it, and the primordial qi attached to it would dissipate too quickly. Unless these two problems could be solved, the arrow would never become the weapon of choice for cultivators. At that time, Ning Ke had never touched talisman Taoism, so he did not think much about it. However, as the successor of the divine talisman master Yen Sei, and seeing so many crazy sublime people in the back of the mountain of the academy, he always felt that it was not impossible to carve a talisman on the thin shaft of an arrow. If he succeeded, wouldn't all the problems be solved? Although he was beaten by fourth brother's mean words by the stream, Ning Ke did not lose all his confidence. After returning to Chang'an, he broke into the South School of Haotian Taoism to find his master and pestered him for 3 days and 2 nights to get some advice. Then, he returned to the old brush pen shop and pondered for a long time with a brush, ink, ruler and line. Finally, he reduced the wind talisman to the smallest size. Late at night, the light was slightly swaying. Sang Sang, who was wrapped in white cloth, slowly floated up from the bed. The white cloth was densely covered with slender strips of paper. Some strange lines could be vaguely seen on the paper. A low whimper came from the closed window. Ning Ke stood beside the bed with a pale face and looked at her quietly. The scene looked extremely strange and terrible. Ning Ke's psyche power in his sense of perception was almost exhausted after drawing more than 40 wind talismans. His face was extremely pale, but his eyes were full of joy when he looked at the little handmaiden who slowly floated up and the paper talismans on her body. As Sang Sang's thin body floated in the air, he moved his hands up and down and said with emotion, "What is a trapeze artist? This is a trapeze artist. This is a magic trick. How can I know who Lu Qian is?" Sang Sang, who was floating in the air, frowned and said, "Young master, I don't know who Lu Qian is either." The next day, Ning Ke came to the back mountain of the academy. He took out the slender fu paper and handed it to sixth brother very solemnly. He said, "Senior brother, it depends on your craftsmanship." Sixth brother took the fu paper and looked at it for a long time in confusion. Then he picked up an arrow from the corner of the room that Ning Ke threw here a few days ago. He rolled the fu paper into a cylinder and stuck it tightly on the thin shaft of the arrow. "Although the size is suitable, I still think it will fail later." Sixth brother took out a fine carving knife and sat at the bright place of the window. He began to carve according to the lines of the fu paper on the shaft of the arrow. His fingers were very stable and did not tremble at all. His knife seemed to be slow, but in fact, it was extremely accurate. He did not want to be elegant but only practical. The hair-like blade perfectly copied the lines on the fu paper. After carving the fu, Ning Ke picked up the arrow and looked at the sky outside the window. Looking at the delicate and beautiful lines on the thin shaft-like patterns, he could not help but feel shocked and sincerely praised, "Sixth brother, your craftsmanship is really good." Sixth brother put the fine carving knife into the leather case and said with a simple and honest smile, "I am a craftsman." The two walked out of the room and came to the mirror lake. Ning Ke took a deep breath and calmed his mind. He put the arrow on the boxwood bough and slightly loosened and tightened his left fingers. His psyche power was released from his sense of perception and passed to the talisman lines on the arrow. For an ordinary talisman master, his psyche power was the key and the talisman he wrote was the lock. Only his psyche power could stimulate the power of the talisman. With a buzzing sound, the tight boxwood bowstring bounced back. Almost at the same time, his psyche power stimulated the talisman on the shaft. A breeze blew between the hard bough and then quickly dispersed. But the arrow did not know where it flew to. There was no trace of the arrow flying on the calm lake. There was no trace of the arrow flying in the forest across the lake. Under the azure sky, not a single trace of an arrow could be found. There must be traces of anything walking, crawling or flying. So where did the arrow engraved with wind talisman disappear in an instant? Ning Ke put down the hardwood bough in a daze and looked back at sixth brother with an inquiring look. Sixth brother spread out his hands with a confused expression on his simple and honest face. Just then, seventh sister walked out of the pavilion in the center of the mirror lake. Her eyebrows were furrowed and she was furious. Her head and body were covered with tiny sawdust, as if she had just crawled out of a lumberyard warehouse. Looking at seventh sister's embarrassed appearance, Ning Kei could not help laughing, thinking that senior sister was really like a silly girl. Sixth brother forged weapons and carved talismans all year round. He was simple and honest, but his eyes were sharp. He had already seen seventh sister's clenched right hand trembling because of anger and a cold metal arrowhead in her palm. His body slightly stiffened and his heart slightly chilled. Without saying anything, he turned around and went into his iron forging room, closing the door tightly. Ning Kei still did not know what had happened. He looked back at the closed iron forging room in confusion, and then turned back to seventh sister in the pavilion and shouted, "Senior sister, did you see an arrow?" Seventh sister suppressed her anger and forced a smile. "What arrow?" "It's just an arrow with a fancy shaft." Seventh sister smiled and stretched out the arrowhead in her right hand. She asked, "Is it this one?" Ning Kei said in surprise, "Yes, it is this." Why is there only an arrowhead? Where is the pole?" Seventh sister gently brushed the hair on her cheeks and dusted the sawdust in her hair. She smiled charmingly and said, "Here." Ning Kei finally came to his senses. Without hesitation, he turned around and ran to the iron forging room, shouting, "Sixth brother! Help! Open the door!" Before he reached the iron forging room, Ning Kei stopped running with a muffled sound. He struggled to turn his head to look behind him. His face was pale and he almost cried. There were more than a dozen embroidery needles on his buttocks, each needle piercing into his flesh. In the pavilion, seventh sister gently pinched the embroidery frame and sneered, "Knives, swords, needles, and now arrows. If I don't teach you some lessons, I really don't know whether you will also use firearms in the future." After the small interlude, the innovative work of developing talisman arrows still had to continue. And because of the noise by the lake, there were two more onlookers. Chen Pippi had just sent food to the chess addict and had nothing to do for the time being. Seventh sister, on the other hand, had to guard against the sawdust rain in the pavilion in the middle of the lake. It was really difficult for her to concentrate on embroidery, so she simply came over to watch. Even if talismans can be carved on the shaft, the power of wind talisman plus flux energy is not something that the shaft itself can bear. Seventh sister held a pot lid and patted the remaining sawdust on her shoulder. She looked at Ning Kei and sixth brother who were concentrating on the experiment and said, "If we can't solve this problem, it's useless to try. Has anyone ever tried this before?" "Yes." "Have they succeeded?" "No." "Are those former divine talisman masters more talented than you, Ning Kei?" "Yes." "Have they succeeded?" "No." "So I don't know why you still insist on this idea." Chen Pippi held the fine iron pot used for delivering food and shook his head. He said, "You are purely wasting time and life." The two onlookers seemed to be giving ideas at the same time, but in fact, they had never given up any opportunity to strike Ning Kei's confidence. Ning Kei didn't care about it. He directly pulled the bow and arrow and said, "Get ready." The fourth experiment of the unprecedented new talisman arrow. Countdown starts. 3, 2, 1, shoot. Chen Pippi shouted loudly. When he shouted the word launch, he immediately raised the fine steel pot in his hand to cover his face. However, because his face was too fat and round, even though the steel pot was huge, a circle of flesh was still exposed. It looked extremely comical and ridiculous. Seventh sister was faster than him. When he shouted the word shoot, she had already raised the pot lid with both hands and desperately protected her beautiful face. Even Ning Kei, after shooting the talisman arrow, immediately jumped to the back of sixth brother and blocked any possible accidents with senior brother's strong body. The first 3 talisman arrows had caused extremely tragic consequences. The fish with white bellies on the surface of the lake and the black bird that had been blown into a bloody mess in the forest were the direct evidence of this tragedy. Sixth brother did not cover his face and carefully looked for the trace of the talisman arrow in the sky. As a weapon developer and manufacturer, he never lacked the spirit of adventure. After a while, he shook his head and said, "Done." Seventh sister carefully poked out half of her face from behind the pot lid and asked, "Senior brother, where is the arrow?" Sixth brother pointed to the dense forest on the other side of the lake and said, "It seems to be over there." Chen Pippi put down the fine iron pot and said with a laugh, "That's where the two senior brothers play the zither and flute." Seventh sister waved her hand and said, "It's okay. Once the two junior brothers start to play the zither and flute, they won't remember anything. Not to mention being drenched with sawdust, even if their butts are pierced by an arrow, they won't have any reaction." Hearing this, Ning Ke slightly trembled and said to sixth brother, "It seems that the material of the arrow shaft is really not good." Sixth brother took out the last talisman arrow from the quiver and asked, "Do you still want to try?" Chen Pippi shook his head and said, "It doesn't make any sense. If Ning Ke can successfully develop the talisman arrow, he can totally set up a sect. He doesn't need to learn the true meaning of talisman Taoism." "I know you are scolding me." Ning Ke shrugged and said, "But I still want to have a try." Looking at Chen Pippi and seventh sister nervously lifting the pot and the pot lid again, he smiled and shook his head, saying, "This time I will try on the spot, without covering my face." Taking off the arrowhead on the talisman arrow, Ning Ke released the psyche power in his sense of perception and directly stimulated the talisman on the arrow shaft. The beautiful and delicate talisman lines on the arrow shaft suddenly lit up, and the surrounding chi of heaven and earth quickly gathered together. A cool breeze was generated out of nowhere and kept twining around the slender arrow shaft. Ning Ke stared at the arrow shaft and used his psyche power to carefully perceive the direction and law of the flow of the wind. Suddenly, everyone could see with their naked eyes that the talisman lines on the thin and long arrow shaft sank deep into the arrow shaft for some unknown reason. The wood that made up the arrow shaft instantly tightened and then tore apart, splitting into extremely fine wood fibers. With a puff, smoke and dust rose by the lakeside and sawdust flew all over the sky. It caused a lot of coughs. Ning Ke brushed off the sawdust on his body and said, "Ordinary materials can't be used to make talisman arrows. We have to change them." "Change what?" "Use refined steel." Chen Pippi shook his head and said, "Refined steel can naturally resist the tearing force of the wind. But the problem is, how to shoot arrows made of refined steel. How can there be such a bowstring in the world? The bow can be made of iron, and the string can also be solved. The problem is that the refined steel arrow is so heavy that I can't shoot it even with my ability." Seventh sister asked, "Will the refined steel arrow be lighter after engraving the talisman?" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "Fourth brother and I have tried it a few days ago. Even if it's light, it's still limited." Sixth brother suddenly said, "I can use refined steel to make the hollow tube." Chen Pippi said, "In order to strengthen the strength of your perception of the talisman on the arrow shaft, I suggest you add some silver in it." Sixth brother nodded and said, "This is not difficult." Ning Ke's eyes gradually lit up. "First of all, thank you. Then please continue to recommend and vote for your monthly support. Finally, these plots are naturally to provide great help for Ning Ke's next volume. Whether you like it or not, please like it. Because I write this book with the idea of making the world happy. Haha. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 189. Sixth brother looked at Ning Ke and said, "If the material of the arrow shaft is changed to mixed silver, your talisman must be redesigned. I will make some mixed silver later, and you can take it back to try." Ning Ke thought of the little handmaiden floating in the old brush pen shop in the middle of the night, scratched his head and said, "Sixth brother, please help me prepare more materials." The previous talisman was very light, and it seems that it should be heavier this time. Seventh sister threw the pot lid to Chunpipi and clapped her hands. She looked at the two people in discussion and asked doubtfully, "Why don't you ask Master Yen Sei to carve talismans on the arrow shaft? Won't the talismans carved by divine talisman masters be better?" For ordinary talisman masters, the talismans they wrote could only be activated by their own psyche power frequency, but this rule was not applicable to divine talisman masters with mysterious states. Divine talisman masters like Master Yen Sei were able to seal the chi of heaven and earth on the talisman paper. As long as the user controlled the chi of heaven and earth with his psyche power, the power of the talisman could be activated. The importance of divine talisman masters to national armies and sects was reflected here. However, divine talisman masters had such a high status that ordinary martial cultivators were not qualified to ask them to specially make weapons for themselves. What's more, if the armors and weapons of martial cultivators wanted to bear the powerful talisman carved by divine talisman masters, they needed enough high-quality or even rare materials. But rare materials must be expensive, which was one of the important reasons why divine talisman weapons were extremely rare. Ning Ke was about to explain the difference between the two to seventh sister when fourth brother, who had been silent for a long time in the dark corner of the room, said, "The talismans carved by divine talisman masters are powerful, but they are others' talismans after all. It's better for youngest brother to carve his own talisman for the close-range weapons he needs. The two can communicate with each other and even change according to the surrounding environment, which is very good for improving his state and enhancing his fighting advantage." After a short pause, he continued, "People like youngest brother who have a great lucky chance can ask Master Yen Sei to carve talismans for him at any time, but he can't do that. Once he becomes dependent on the fixed divine talisman, it will be more difficult for him to make progress. What's more, the talismans on the weapons are not made by himself. If they are damaged, where can he repair them?" A few days ago, Ning Ke wanted to ask his master to carve a talisman on his weapon. At that time, Master Yen Sei's answer was very similar to fourth brother's. He could not help but nod. Suddenly, he thought of the thing that Chunpipi mentioned when he first entered the back of the mountain of the academy. He looked at fourth brother and asked curiously, "Fourth brother, the armor of General Xiaohou?" Fourth brother replied, "The divine talisman armor on Xiaohou is a divine talisman designed by Professor Huang He himself. Your sixth brother and I are just blacksmiths and carvers, and we did some technical work." Thinking of the general who wore the divine talisman armor and had been victorious in the Yen territory for more than 10 years, Ning Ke smiled with mixed feelings after a long time of silence. He shook his head and sighed, "We, the four border generals of the Tang Empire, are really honored to be able to invite a divine talisman master like Professor Huang He to make talismans and two senior brothers to make armor with great care." Fourth brother shook his head expressionlessly and said, "The four generals have no influence on the academy. Although I'm not a divine talisman master, General Su sure can't ask me to do anything if I don't want to. After all, it's because of Professor Huang He. Since he has asked, we can't refuse." "Is Professor Huang He familiar with General Xiaohou?" Ning Ke asked casually. Fourth brother looked up at him and said after a moment of silence, "Professor Huang He is a visiting professor of the Imperial Center Administration. It's his duty to enhance the strength of the imperial military." Hearing the words, Imperial Center Administration, Ning Ke remembered the token hidden in his belt. Since His Majesty gave him the token, he had never visited the Imperial Center Administration. He only knew that it was an institution used by the Empire to manage cultivators. He couldn't help but wonder if he could get some benefits from his identity in the Imperial Center Administration. Walking stones at the bottom of the stream and testing arrows by the lake, time seemed to pass much faster in the back mountain of the academy than in the outside world. Seeing that the sun was setting and the light was getting darker, Ning Ke took the heavy mixed silver wrought iron wrapped in leather from sixth brother, saluted to senior brothers and sisters with hands folded in front, and then walked out of the mountain. Chen Pipi saw him out of the mountain. Before entering the fog, he suddenly stopped and asked with doubt on his chubby face, "Did Master Yen really say that your aptitude in talisman Taoism can be ranked in the top 3 in history?" Ning Ke patted his shoulder and comforted him. "Are you feeling a little lost, lonely, and cold because you finally found that you can't compare with me in cultivation? Think about it. You can't enter talisman Taoism, why do you compare with me in this? Think about Lu Bai, the sage of sword, he can't catch up with me in this aspect." Hearing that Ning Ke compared himself with the most powerful man in the world, Chen Pipi's mood didn't improve immediately. He replied sarcastically, "I am a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. Do you think I will envy you, a mere no-doubt state cultivator? That's not what you said." Ning Ke retorted with a smile, "I have only cultivated for a year and jumped from the initial state to the no-doubt state. Who can be sure that I can't enter the knowing destiny state in the future? You only have 10 acupoints in the ocean of Qi and mountain of snow. You have to admit that your aptitude is inferior." Chen Pipi looked at him sympathetically and said, "Even if the headmaster of the academy forcibly teaches your wooden head to the knowing destiny state, so what? You are just a wooden head in the knowing destiny state." Ning Ke frowned and said, "The ocean of Qi and mountain of snow is blocked, but it doesn't mean that my head is blocked." Chen Pipi stood in front of the fog on the mountain path and looked back at him with a smile. He said, "Anyway, I'm not sure whether your aptitude in talisman Taoism is in the top 3 in history. But I can be sure that even if you enter the knowing destiny state, you must be the weakest one in history. You can't influence the Qi of heaven and earth more than 3 feet away from you. How can you call yourself a grand cultivator then?" When he mentioned grand cultivators, he deliberately emphasized the word grand cultivator, and bit down on it. Ning Ke's face had long been trained in the cold wind of Min Mountain and the wild sand of the frontier fortress. He didn't care about Chen Pipi's sarcasm at all. He just thought that it was a pity that he hadn't seen the legendary headmaster of the academy and eldest brother since he entered the 2nd floor of the academy for several months. He thought that if he could be taught by the headmaster of the academy, how fast would his cultivation progress be? When will the headmaster and eldest brother come back? No one knows. Traveling abroad, there will be a time when they come back, right? It's been more than a year. Traveling to enjoy the scenery and visiting friends is much happier than cultivating in the back mountain. If it were me, I wouldn't be willing to come back." Ning Ke looked at him with a smile and asked, "I heard that the headmaster only took eldest brother when he traveled around the world these years. Why didn't he take you? Last year in the old library, you bragged every day that you were the favorite of the headmaster of the academy. It doesn't seem like it." Chen Pipi shook his head and said with emotion, "You don't understand. The world respects the headmaster of the academy and doesn't dare to disrespect him. As students, of course, no one can serve the headmaster of the academy well like eldest brother. If it were you, would you take a spoiled daughter out or a wife who can cook?" It was a very absurd question, but Ning Ke actually began to seriously think about it while standing in front of the fog on the mountain path. After thinking for a long time, he answered, "I will take care of Sang Sang. She can cook and serve." The summer in the wilderness was about to end. The temperature of the fertile grassland gradually cooled down and the color of the grass on the black mud gradually faded. However, the grassland in the north far away from the central plains was still a lively scene. Countless tents were connected like clouds, and people were slaughtering sheep and barbecuing meat, singing and dancing merrily. After countless tragic and bloody battles, the desolate man who migrated from the extremely cold north to the hot south finally defeated the grassland barbarians will to resist after 1,000 years. The left king's palace paid the price of thousands of elite cavalrymen's deaths, but still could not stop the desolate man's unyielding footsteps. They had to move all the tribes close to the north to the grasslands and pastures further south, leaving the fertile grasslands in the north to the desolate man. The brave desolate man warriors won and had a new home in their homeland 1,000 years ago. This homeland was cold and harsh in the eyes of the Central Plains people. But for the suffering people who lived in the extremely cold north all year round, it was undoubtedly as beautiful as heaven. Not long ago, the women and children of the desolate man tribe, who had been lagging behind because of the slow migration, finally arrived at this new homeland. The number of people who successfully arrived far exceeded the desolate man's expectation when they decided to migrate south, which made all the desolate man even more surprised. In the tents of the grassland, relatives reunited and settled down in their own homes. They were familiar with the beautiful but strange new life. The smell of milk from the mutton soup and the smell of burnt dung mixed together and smelled extremely happy to the desolate man. The party lasted from night to the evening of the next day. The desolate man warriors used the liquor they robbed from the grassland palace to reward themselves and their hard-working families. Then they reminisced about their relatives who died on the way or hugged their wives tenderly and returned to their tents to sleep. The oil lamps did not need to be lit at all. The tent in the northwest of the grassland, which looked simple but was obviously much larger, was brightly lit. More than 10 braziers were hanging in the air half a person's height, brightly illuminating the tent. The elders of the desolate man and the most powerful warrior leaders celebrated the victory for a whole day. But then they fell into deep thought and silence because of a certain topic brought up by an elder. What's so scary about the Tangs? A leader of the desolate man warriors, who was as strong as a bear, looked at the old elders in confusion. He said in a low voice, "We are all natural warriors. Even when we are tired from migrating thousands of miles to the south, we can still defeat the palace on the grassland. As long as we rest on this grassland for half a year, who in the world can be our match?" The desolate man elder sitting in the deepest part of the tent looked at him calmly. After a moment of silence, he said, "No matter how strong a warrior is, once he is controlled by pride, he will become weak." The strong leader of the desolate man warriors looked flustered after being criticized by the highly respected first elder. He quickly bowed his head and asked for forgiveness. However, it was clear from his eyes that he still did not understand the fear of his elders. This grassland was originally the hometown of the desolate man. We were once the most powerful kingdom in the world. But why were our ancestors forced to leave this fertile grassland 1,000 years ago and go to the cold region of the far north to suffer? The elder looked around at the people in the tent and said expressionlessly, "Because the Tangs defeated us." After a long silence, the elder continued, "I want you to remember the reason why our ancestors were forced to leave the grassland, not to seek revenge, but to remind you how powerful the Tang Empire is. 1,000 years ago, our ancestors swept across the mainland and no one dared to resist. Even the West Hill Divine Kingdom only wanted to preach at the beginning and had no hostility. Until the Li Tang Empire was founded, our ancestors were defeated again and again. In the end, they almost lost their race. They signed an agreement with the Tang Empire and retreated to the cold region, swearing not to return to the south. Only then did they retain some of their seeds." The elders slowly told the stories of the desolate man that had been passed down from generation to generation. There was a dead silence in the tent. Our ancestors' territory was 100 times larger than ours, and their population was 100 times larger. Their experts were as numerous as the stars in the night sky. But they still died in the hands of the Tangs. Now our tribe has suffered in the hot sea for 1,000 years, but we only have a few 100,000 people. How can we be compared to our ancestors? How can we look down on the Tangs? What we need to worry about now is how to deal with the Tangs once we come into contact with them. There was a reply in the tent, "We don't want the land of the Central Plains. We snatched back our own grassland. Even if the barbarian royal court is driven to the south by us and they have a dispute with the Central Plains, what does that have to do with us?" Someone said worriedly, our tribe's move to the south is a violation of the agreement we signed with the Tangs 1,000 years ago. If the Tangs use this as an excuse, how should we deal with it? The elder looked down and said, the left king's court, the right king's court, and the golden king's court. After 1,000 years, there are only some barbarians left on the grassland. And we, the real descendants of the heavenly Khan, are forced to live a difficult life beside the hot sea. It's fine if we can survive, but since we can't, moving to the south is inevitable. The night is ahead and death is behind. Any agreement is meaningless. Then he looked up at the most important people in the desolate man's tribe and said in a low voice, but if we can avoid a war with the Tang Empire, we must. If the Tangs send an envoy to question us, we must deal with it well. Everyone in the tent agreed in unison. Suddenly, the elder noticed that the person was not in the tent. He could not help but frown. Although that person would never express any opinions in the meeting of the elders and was used to being silent, he was after all the most powerful warrior of the desolate man. It was not right that he was not present when such an important matter was being discussed. Where did he go? I don't know. Just as the old man was about to say something, he suddenly sensed a faintly discernible aura coming from the far west. He could not sense how powerful the aura was, but the unique aura deeply touched his old heart. The elder's body suddenly stiffened and his face revealed a look of awe and fear. He hurriedly moved his body backward and knelt down towards the west. He stretched out his hands in front of him, looking unusually respectful. The skinny elders beside him also felt the aura from the west. Their expressions changed drastically and they quickly bent down on the carpet and sincerely reached out their hands to kowtow. The middle-aged leaders of the desolate man tribes did not feel the aura. They could not help but feel shocked and confused when they saw the reaction of the elders. They subconsciously knelt down and kowtowed to the west. Thinking about the new year, I was so happy and excited that I couldn't sleep again. I didn't sleep for a day and night, so I wrote a chapter and then write the next one. When I am too sleepy, I will update as much as I have written. I am so crazy. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 190. There was an ox cart on the wilderness. It was an ordinary wooden cart. The wheels of the cart were slightly deformed after traveling for thousands of miles. It squeaked from time to time as it traveled on the hardened grassland. It shook up and down and left an invisible track. It passed through the soft grass and the ruts were deep. There were a few tiny fish jumping in the muddy water that seeped out. The cow was an ordinary big yellow cow. Its legs and hooves were still strong even after traveling for thousands of miles. It walked on the slightly hard grassland and let out low moos from time to time. It moved up and down to feed on the grass, leaving a trace of grass that couldn't be seen. It passed through the soft grass and the ox's hooves were deep. There were a few white weeds lying in the shallow puddles. It was an ordinary wooden cart on the official road of the Central Plains and an ordinary yellow ox in the fields of the Central Plains. However, it was unusual for them to appear in the wilderness. If anyone could see this scene, they would find it very magical. The person driving the ox cart was a scholar with straight eyebrows and wide eyes. The dusty journey had made the old cotton robe on his body look even older, but the expression on his face looked even more simple and amiable. For some reason, the pair of worn-out straw sandals on the single shaft had not fallen apart after walking on the road for more than a year. The water ladle on his waist swayed slightly with the rise and fall of the ox cart. Suddenly, a song came from the ox cart. You always don't let me go home. It makes me worry so much. Yo yo. The scholar driving the ox smiled and patted the back of the ox to signal it to stop. Then he turned to the carriage behind him and said, Headmaster, do you want to go home? The curtain was lifted. A tall, gray-haired old man walked out. He rubbed his waist and stretched his arms. Looking at the boundless wilderness, he said angrily, "I've been out for more than a year, but I've been wandering around in these desolate places with nothing to eat and nothing to play. Who doesn't want to go back to Changpan?" The old man was the headmaster, so the scholar was naturally the eldest brother of the academy. The eldest brother smiled and helped the headmaster get off the cart. Then he took out a low stool from the cart and asked the headmaster to sit down. He comforted him and said, "It's good to see the scenery along the way." The headmaster was very tall. He sat on the low stool and the hem of his cotton robe covered the stool completely. It looked like he was squatting on the grassland and looked a little funny. The headmaster said unhappily, "What scenery is there to see? The hot sea is really frozen. I can't even take a hot spring bath. Although we can't bathe in a hot spring, at least we can eat peony fish." The eldest senior brother comforted him. There was a sea in the cold region of the far north, and there was a volcano at the bottom of the sea. It was not frozen all year round, so it was called the hot sea. In the depths of the hot sea, there was a fish named peony. It was described as plump and tender. If it was cut vertically with a knife, each piece of fish would look like a peony. Perhaps only people like the headmaster and his disciple would know about this. Hearing the words, peony fish, the headmaster stroked his long beard and nodded in agreement. He said, "Child, I can't agree more with you. As long as there is a peony fish in the stomach, any long and arduous journey will be worth it." The eldest senior brother took out a kitchen knife, a chopping board, and a bucket. He held the ice in his hand and melted the fat and tender peony fish inside. When the fish had melted to 70%, he held the knife and began to cut it raw. The headmaster looked at the peony fish that was still fresh on the chopping board. He stroked his beard and praised, "Food must be fresh and rare to taste good. If this fish was not only found in the hot sea of the far north, how could it be so delicious after being sandwiched by the cold and heat? How could it make people feel the beauty of eating for thousands of miles?" The eldest brother smiled and did not reply. He focused on cutting. The peony fish was extremely fat and tender. Even a sharp kitchen knife could not cut into the skin without messing it up. He cut very slowly and carefully. There seemed to be no distance between the two cuts. However, when he lifted the knife, there was already a layer of white fish that was as thin as a cicada's wing. If it's a river fish, you can't cut it too thin. If it's too thin, it will lose its taste. But the peony fish is found in the deep sea and its meat is very elastic. The thinner the better. Child, you have basically mastered some of the principles of the world these years. The headmaster shook his head and praised. He took out soy sauce, a green seasoning, and ginger juice with his left hand and poured them into a bowl. His right hand reached to the chopping board and picked up the thin white fish with his index and middle fingers. He swung it in the bowl like a koi fish swinging its tail and quickly sent it into his mouth. The headmaster closed his eyes to enjoy it as he chewed. His expression was as sweet as the peony fish in his mouth. After a while, he opened his eyes and looked at the kitchen knife on the chopping board. He said hurriedly, "Faster, faster." The eldest brother smiled. His hands did not speed up at all. He still cut slowly and meticulously. The headmaster could not wait any longer. He took the kitchen knife from his hand and sighed. "You are good at everything, but you always do things slowly. I am so worried." The eldest brother explained respectfully, "I am not talented, so I always like to think more before doing things. You have to learn from Mo in this aspect." Think when you should think, and don't think when you shouldn't. Second brother is so talented that I can't compare with him. If he heard you say that, wouldn't he be ashamed to death like he was when he was young? The headmaster's knife moved like the wind. In just a moment, the chopping board was filled with snowflake-like slices of fish. It really looked like a blooming white peony. The remaining fish bones and internal organs were wrapped in a layer of film and looked as beautiful as a piece of amber. The second brother was free at this time, so he went into the carriage and took 2 pairs of chopsticks. After the headmaster was satisfied, he picked up a few pieces of peony fish and carefully tasted it. Then he sent the amber-like fish bones and internal organs to the mouth of the big yellow bull. It was natural for the big yellow bull to eat grass, but this big yellow bull ate fish. It opened its mouth and swallowed it. It chewed and shook its head from time to time, looking extremely happy. The headmaster was holding a small wine pot and slowly sipped. He suddenly saw this scene and could not help but scold. The bull chewed on the peony. What a waste! How can fish be eaten like this? After saying this, the headmaster took out another precious peony fish from the ice bucket. He rolled up his cotton sleeves and the kitchen knife rose and fell. In a moment, a pile of white peony-like fish appeared on the chopping board. The headmaster used his chopsticks to pick up a piece of peony fish, dipped it in some seasoning, and threw it into the mouth of the big yellow bull. The headmaster did not mean that the big yellow bull was spoiling things by eating the peony fish, but that the way it was eating it was spoiling things because it could not taste the peony fish. The big yellow bull chewed 2 mouthfuls and was stunned at first. Then 2 lines of tears flowed down from the corner of its eyes. It then began to shake its head, bouncing its front hooves and mooing. The eldest brother hesitated and asked, "Headmaster, is it happy or spicy?" The headmaster said, "Of course it's happy." The eldest brother thought that the headmaster's words were always right, so he took the chopsticks and continued to feed the big yellow bull the peony fish. Even the desolate man could not survive in the cold region of the far north. However, this big yellow cow could pull a carriage around and come back safe and sound. Moreover, it was still so strong. Of course, it was not an ordinary big yellow cow. Therefore, it was not difficult to understand that it ate fish and not grass. The eldest brother washed the chopsticks and bowls, then sat on the shaft and stared at the south for a while. He said, "I wonder how the academy is doing now and how much the desolate man's southward impact will be." The headmaster sat cross-legged on the ox cart and read a book. He answered casually, "We'll know when we get back." The eldest brother smiled and looked at the headmaster. He said, "I'm very curious about who entered the second floor." The headmaster looked at the page and said with his head down, "If you want to know, you can go and see for yourself." The eldest brother shook his head and said, "It's too far. We can't go back anytime soon." After saying this, he suddenly stood up and looked at the north of the grassland with a very clean smile on his face. There was a row of very tall black shadows. Looking closely, they were the snowfield dire wolves that were forced to go south with the desolate man in the cold region of the far north. Hundreds of giant wolves lined up like soldiers and their huge figures gave people a great sense of pressure. However, neither the headmaster nor he had much reaction. On the contrary, the snowfield dire wolves reacted very strangely. To them, the big yellow bull from the central plains was as rare as the peony fish and must be delicious. However, for some reason, the snowfield dire wolves, who were known for their ferocity in killing, did not pounce on them. Instead, they all let out shrill cries and retreated in fear, as if they had sensed a terrifying aura that was far beyond their imagination. This group of snowfield dire wolves was the one that fought with the Tang siblings at the mountain pass. The skinny male wolf led the beautiful female wolf away from the rest of the pack and slowly walked towards the ox cart. When they were about a few hundred steps away from the ox cart, the ordinary male wolf stopped and didn't dare to move forward anymore. The skinny ordinary male wolf looked at the ox cart and seemed very excited. Its body trembled slightly and it squatted back, raising its 2 front paws, looking like a human student saluting to his teacher. The eldest brother looked at the male wolf and said in surprise, "Teacher, isn't this the wolf from 7 years ago?" They are actually married. The headmaster smiled and did not say anything. The eldest brother glanced at the headmaster and found that the headmaster did not object. He left the ox cart and walked a few steps towards the ordinary male wolf. He pointed to the northwest of the grassland and said, "Don't continue to the south. There are too many people there. Go that way and there will be a large piece of coniferous forest in another 250 miles. The ordinary male wolf waved its front paws to salute and bent down to touch its head on the ground for a long time. Then it stood up and looked at the ox cart reluctantly. With a sad howl, it led its wife and subordinates to the northwest. Let's go back to Changpan. The headmaster rolled up his book, lifted the curtain and walked into the ox cart. The second brother turned his head and looked at the meadow in the distance with a smile. He sat on the shaft and patted the ox's back. The ox cart creaked and went south. Looking at the ox cart gradually disappearing at the end of the grassland, Tang Xiaotang stood up with the sleeping snow wolf cub in her arms. Her face was full of confusion. After a long time, she murmured, "This is the headmaster." Tang stood beside her and looked at the rut left on the grassland. He nodded. Tang Xiaotang shook her head. She felt that the gluttonous old man was completely different from the headmaster she had imagined. After a moment of silence, Tang said, "I wanted to see if there was a lucky chance for you to become the headmaster's disciple. But since the headmaster did not say anything, it means that the lucky chance is not here yet. We will talk about it in the future." Tang Xiaotang asked in surprise, "You mean the headmaster knows that we are peeping here?" Tang turned around and walked down the meadow. He said, "Since he is the headmaster, he naturally knows everything." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 191. Due to my disordered biological clock, my mental state has always been sluggish. Due to the rush to update, I really didn't have time to check. That's why I've made a lot of mistakes recently. I'd like to apologize to everyone here. As before, after accumulating a certain number of chapters, I will find a day to completely revise it. Although, after I revise it, I doubt that anyone will read it a second time. Here, I would like to express my sincere thanks to fellow reader Longshan Wuji. He helped me look for mistakes in the book review section, and then I discovered that there were actually so many mistakes in a single chapter. I am ashamed, and I express my sincerest gratitude to him. I want to make a manuscript after the new year. If there is a manuscript, I will try to check and revise it before I publish it. In addition, I will write a year-end summary today or tomorrow. There are some things I want to talk to you about. No other services. Tang Xiaotang reached out and rubbed the soft belly of the snow wolf cub. She thought of the scene she had seen before and looked at her brother's back. She asked curiously, "What happened to that wolf?" Maybe the headmaster saw that wolf many years ago when he traveled to the northern wilderness. The wolf was enlightened probably because of this encounter. Otherwise, how could an ordinary male wolf understand the power of heaven and earth by himself? Tang Xiaotang was shocked. The headmaster can even enlighten a wolf? That's amazing. Brother, who do you think is more powerful, the headmaster or the headmaster? Tang paused and said after a moment of silence, the headmaster was not as powerful as the headmaster. But after he cultivated the 23-year cicada cultivation, I think he is still not as powerful as the headmaster. Brother, you told me a few days ago that most of the civil and military officials of the Tang Empire studied in the academy. The people on the second floor are not to be trifled with. The headmaster has been the dean of the academy for more than 100 years. So one word from the headmaster can shake the Tang Empire? Isn't the emperor worried? About what? It's his throne. How could the headmaster care about something like the throne? Then isn't the emperor worried that the headmaster will affect the politics? Who would want to have a mountain above their heads? Whether the emperor is willing or not, the headmaster has been quietly existing in the south of Chang'an city for many years before he was born. As for the small things like politics, why would the headmaster care? Politics are small things. Do you think the headmaster will intervene if we fight with the Tang Empire? If he's really as powerful as you say, how can the tribe resist him? I told you, the headmaster doesn't care about these small things. Tang Xiaotang held the snow wolf cub and quickened her pace to her brother's side. She stared at him with her big bright eyes and asked in surprise, even this kind of thing is a trivial matter. Then what's the big deal? In the eyes of a person like the headmaster of the academy, everything in the world is trivial. As for what really matters in his eyes, how can people like you and I know? Why bother guessing? Where there are people, there will be trouble. Where there are people, there will be trouble. Humans lacked the means to solve this problem. Apart from war and violence, the only way to solve it was to have a meeting. While the desolate men were discussing their next strategy in the meadow, the emperor and ministers of the Tang Empire in the distant south were also having a meeting. The Daming Palace outside Chang'an became the emperor's residence every summer. Because it was inconvenient for the ministers to go out of the city, there were fewer political meetings, big or small. There was only a formal court meeting every 3 days. Although it's much cooler outside the Daming Palace than inside the city, it's still a little hot. This tremella soup has been chilled. Drink it quickly before you go back to the city, lest you fall off your horses and annoy me again. Li Zhongyi, the emperor of the Tang Empire, said to the ministers. He took his bowl from eunuch Lin and brought it to his lips, gulping it down. The government affairs that needed the emperor's approval for 3 days were finished. Although the Daming Palace was quiet and pleasant, it was not as comfortable as their own garden. Although the tremella soup was refreshing, it was not as delicious as their own porridge. After the ministers thanked the emperor, they drank the tremella soup as fast as they could and were ready to leave the palace. Just as the ministers were about to leave, the emperor suddenly remembered something. He waved his hand and called them back, saying, "There's another small matter." 3 days ago, the military ministry reported that the cavalry of the left king's palace went deep into the Yan territory and looted the merchants and villages. I thought it was a matter of the Yan kingdom after all, so I didn't want to pay attention to it. But on second thought, it seemed a little inappropriate to completely ignore it. Moreover, it involves the southward migration of the desolate men, so the imperial court has to come up with a strategy to talk to the West Hill and other countries. Hurry up and discuss it. When the minister of the military ministry heard it was about this matter, he hurriedly reported, the troops of the Right King's Palace and the Golden King's Palace did not move. The intelligence department reported that the cavalry of the Left King's Palace did not cause much loss when they entered the Yan Kingdom. What does the people of the Yan Kingdom have to do with me? It's not a matter of loss or not. The emperor slightly raised his eyebrows and a trace of toughness flashed across his gentle face. He said in a low voice, when the Tang Empire was in charge of drawing the boundary line, the Chanyu of the Three Kings' Palace personally signed it. Now the cavalry of the Left King's Palace dares to cross this line. What I care about is why they dare to cross the line. In the eyes of the emperor and ministers of the Tang Empire, the barbarians on the grassland were detestable but could not cause any trouble. Indeed, they did not treat it as a big deal. The minister of the Ministry of Rights lightly stroked his beard. He even had the leisure to think from the perspective of the barbarian royal court. He smiled and said, the desolate man migrated to the south. These barbarians could not defeat them. The most fertile grassland was occupied by them. They had to live on the grassland and rely on robbing. Speaking of which, they do have some difficulties. The emperor shook his head and said, even if they have difficulties, since they were granted titles by the empire, they should have told the imperial court in advance. The imperial court would naturally have arrangements. Now they secretly started to attack without telling us. Of course, we can't do that. We must beat them back first. After we beat them back, I will listen to their difficulties. Your Majesty is wise. Although the left king's palace is harassing the Yen kingdom, they have crossed the line drawn by the empire. This is a provocation to the Central Plains. As the ruler of the Central Plains, the empire must respond. The Prime Minister nodded slowly. He looked back at the Minister of the Military Ministry and said unhappily, the General of the Army is closest to the Yen territory. He can just send a cavalry to beat the left king's palace back. How can your Majesty worry about such a small matter? Although it is a small matter, we still need to send troops. Moreover, we need to inform capital Cheng in advance if we enter Yen territory to fight in the north. Otherwise, wouldn't the Yen kingdom's emperor and ministers be scared to death? The Minister of the Military Ministry turned to the direction of the Dragon Throne and asked seriously, Your Majesty, I think the empire needs to seriously consider the desolate man migrating to the south. These desolate men violated the 1,000-year agreement and migrated to the south. How should the empire react? Don't think I don't know what you mean. Which old general is bored at home and wants to lead troops to war? Don't wars cost money? The emperor laughed and scolded before continuing. The intelligence said that after the desolate man occupied the grassland in the north of the wilderness, they tried their best to restrain their people from moving south. They are so far away from the empire. If they don't bother me, I won't bother. We can bring up the agreement from 1,000 years ago when we need to. The arrogant desolate man were beaten by our ancestors and only a few 100,000 people are left. It is meaningless for us descendants to take advantage of them now. In the secluded hall after the court meeting, the nation master of the Tang Empire, Li Qingshan, looked slightly worried. He whispered to the emperor, the Divine Hall's reaction to this matter is a bit strange. They actually issued an edict for such a small matter. Now the South Jin Kingdom and Yueluan Kingdom should be preparing to help the North. It should have nothing to do with the left king's palace's disturbance. Since the desolate man has returned, they must have smelled the scent of the devil's doctrine. Hearing the words, Divine Hall, the emperor, who was calm but full of confidence in the court meeting, frowned and said, when Emperor Taizu first established the empire, he joined forces with the West Hill to drive the desolate man out of the wilderness. Decades ago, youngest uncle broke into the devil's doctrine with a sword and killed all the powerhouses of the devil's doctrine left behind by the desolate man. Now that the devil's doctrine has declined, what is the West Hill Divine Hall worried about? Li Qingshan said, after all, the devil's doctrine and the desolate man are inextricably linked. Of course the Divine Hall will be more vigilant. This edict has mobilized all the countries to help the North. The West Hill even sent the apologetic knights. In my opinion, other than guarding against the devil's doctrine and helping the Yen Emperor stabilize the border, they also want to show their strength to the world. The Emperor looked at his raised right arm and said, they want to show off their muscles. Who else from the Yueluan Kingdom and the South Jin Kingdom went? The Imperial Center Administration reported that the Buddhism sect of the Yueluan Kingdom sent some young powerhouses. The Sword Garret of the South Jin Kingdom also sent some people. But what we really need to pay attention to, other than the apologetic knights, is the judicial department of the Divine Hall. The Emperor raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, so, other than expanding their influence, they also need to train their troops. It's even more inappropriate for the Tang Empire not to send someone. It's fine if the Tang Empire doesn't interfere, but if we do, we have to control everything. Then let Xia Ho go and have a look himself. Hearing Xia Ho's name, Li Qingshan frowned and said, wouldn't it seem that we value the barbarians too much if we send the general to deal with these small matters? I know what you are worried about. The emperor looked at him and raised his eyebrows. He said, I want Xia Ho to go personally, not because I value the cavalry of the palace, or even the edict of the divine hall or the young people of the various countries. I want to see Xia Ho himself. Li Qingshan understood what the emperor meant. He shook his head and sighed, General Xia Ho is famous all over the world. If he goes to the north of Yen, he will definitely be the commander of the coalition army. Your Majesty is wise. The emperor suddenly thought of something. He looked up at Li Qingshan and asked, is it the time for the students of the academy to go to the frontier fortress for practice? Li Qingshan answered, the practice in the past years was always in autumn. It's already the end of summer. It's fine to go a few days earlier. Where was the practice originally planned? The southern defender general of the state, Su Shi, went to fight with the southern Marsh Mountain tribe. The emperor shook his head and said, the southern Marsh Mountain tribe said it's spring. I don't want Su Shi to come back because the air there is humid, which is very good for his lung disease. What can the students of the academy do in such a peaceful frontier fortress? Tomorrow, I will write a letter to the academy and ask them to change the place for practice this year. Li Qingshan guessed the emperor's intention. He frowned and asked, leave the north of Yen kingdom and enter the wilderness? Yes. The emperor said, since the West Hill Divine Palace has issued the edict, the young people of all countries should go and show off, why don't the young people of the empire go? There has been a saying that the young generation of the Tang Empire is lacking in talents and the empire is declining. I want to show the world whether the Tang Empire has young talents or not. Li Qingshan said seriously after a moment of hesitation, Your Majesty, the students of the academy this year, especially the Tang students, are not outstanding. Linchuan Wangying is good, but he is still too young. Isn't there still Ning Ke? The emperor said Ning Ke's name naturally, as if he was saying there was meat porridge if there was no rice. Li Qingshan said, Your Majesty, Ning Ke has entered the second floor of the academy. According to the old rules, he doesn't need to go to the frontier fortress for practice. The emperor said, even if he enters the second floor, he is still a student of this year. Let him lead the team. Li Qingshan saw that the emperor was quite determined, so he could not help but persuade him with a bitter smile, let's not talk about whether the second floor of the academy is too cautious or not. Ning Ke is just a beginner in Talisman Tong, and his cultivation aptitude is ordinary. It can be said that he is the weakest student in the history of the second floor. How can a mere no-doubt state suppress the young talents of all countries? And if something happens to him in the wilderness, how can we explain it to the headmaster when he comes back? The emperor laughed and said, a jade cannot be made into a tool without cutting, and a man cannot become a talent without grinding. You have seen Ning Ke's file in the military ministry. You know what kind of person he is. If he can't survive on the battlefield, who can? Late at night, the Daming Palace was shrouded in starlight and the shadow of the mountains. The wind came from the north, passing through the forest and brushing the grass into the palace. The emperor stood leaning against the railing, looking calm and dignified. He was not as casual as he was in the previous discussion. The palace maids and eunuchs had already been sent far away. It was quiet beside the railing. Only the empress looked at him quietly. She frowned slightly and looked a little worried. Do you think there is really an underworld? If there really was an underworld, where was it? The headmaster travels the world all year round. Is he looking for the underworld? It is said that the desolate man returned to the south because the night in the cold region of the far north has been getting longer these years. Is there really a day when the night covers the stars? The night covers the stars, and the country will not be peaceful. This was a comment that the imperial astronomer came up with after observing the stars many years ago. Because this comment implied that there would be women in the palace in the future, which would be very unfavorable to the empire. Thus, some people led it to the empress, and others to the fourth princess, who was most favored by the emperor. Who knew how much trouble it had caused? After the incident with the imperial astronomer, the empress lived in peace in the palace and did not express any opinions on state affairs. Princess Li Yu was even married off to the grassland because of this incident. The impact was not small. Suddenly hearing these 4 words from the emperor today, the empress' expression changed slightly. After a long silence, she said in a low voice, "Who would have thought that Mr. Ku would charge into the mountains with a single sword? Master died so suddenly that there were many secrets in the sect that could not be passed down in time. But I have never heard of a place called the underworld when I was in the sect." The emperor turned and looked at her gently. He asked, "Your people are returning to the south. Do you not want to take a look?" The empress shook her head slowly and said, 1,000 years ago, the divine hall sent priests to the wilderness to preach. In the end, there was another cultivation method in the world. But that method was recognized by the divine hall as the devil. Since then, the desolate man and the devil's doctrine could not be separated. But since I left the sect many years ago, the desolate man is naturally no longer my people. At this point, she suddenly stopped talking and looked up at the emperor calmly. She asked, "You decided to let Xiahou lead the army in the north of Yen. Do you suspect him?" The emperor turned to look at the mountain in front of the railing. After a moment of silence, he said, "Yes." The empress looked at his side profile and forcibly suppressed the sadness in her heart. She said in a trembling voice, "Many years ago, I, a woman from the devil's doctrine, followed the orders of my master to the south. I tried my best to get close to you and confuse you in order to kill you, the emperor of the Tang Empire. In the end, after I failed, you did not kill me. Instead, you married me and made me the empress." The emperor was reminded of the past. He touched the railing and said emotionally, "Back then, only father, mother, and Qing Shan knew your identity. If not for the headmaster's words, it would have been extremely difficult for us to be together. But, even if the headmaster did not say anything, no matter how much father and mother objected, I would still marry you. Because you are the woman I want to marry." The empress said sadly, "So I don't understand. Your Majesty, why are you always so suspicious of Xiahou when you have so much forgiveness and love for me? He has fought for the empire at the border for many years. Can't he gain some trust from you? Do you still think that he will return to the devil's doctrine or even rebel against the desolate man's tribe?" The emperor turned around and looked into her eyes. He said, "You are wrong. I have never worried that General Xiahou will return to the devil's doctrine or rebel against the desolate man's tribe. He knows very well that any general who wants to rebel will die under the law of the Tang Empire. He killed Murong Linshuang to show his sincerity to the West Hill. He will never be able to return to the devil's doctrine. Whether it is the person who cultivates the 23-year cicada cultivation or the other people in the devil's doctrine, as long as they reappear in the Central Plains, the first thing they will do is to kill him. Don't forget that Murong Linshuang is that person's favorite female disciple." The empress asked in a trembling voice, "Then why do you suspect him?" The emperor said expressionlessly, "I suspect his relationship with the West Hill." The empress laughed bitterly at herself and said, "You know very well why." "Why?" "Because he knows that the West Hill Divine Palace has always suspected him. Because he knows that the West Hill Divine Palace has always suspected your relationship with him. Can the West Hill Divine Palace find evidence from him that you are the former saintess of the devil's doctrine?" The emperor shook his head and said with emotion, "The emperors of the Tang Empire will study with the headmaster in the academy for a period of time. Their learning speed varies. I don't know if I should praise myself or feel sorry that I did not study with the headmaster for a long time. In those short days, the headmaster said something that I remember the most clearly. There are many strong and brave people in the world. After they compromise for the first time, they will continue to compromise. In the end, they will even form some kind of abnormal psychological state. From compromise to active cooperation, they will turn from the victim to the perpetrator, and they don't even understand why it happened. The West Hill Divine Palace has been guessing your true identity all these years. They tried their best to test it. Xia Ho tried his best to cover up for you and make friends with the West Hill Divine Palace. He did not hesitate to cooperate with the West Hill Divine Palace to make trouble when I was not in Chang'an. He did not hesitate to let the villages in the Yen territory die because of the West Hill Divine Palace. He even did not hesitate to kill his most beloved woman. In my opinion, these are really unnecessary. Even if the West Hill Divine Palace knows that my empress is the saintess of the devil's doctrine, what can they do? The emperor patted the railing and looked at the stars in the night sky. He sighed and said, "If Xia Ho did not do these things because of you, I would have killed him many years ago." I thought that as time passed, he would understand these things, but it seems that he has not changed. He left the devil's doctrine many years ago. Unfortunately, there is still a demon in his heart. This demon is the lover that he cooked and killed, the visiting professor of the West Hill Divine Palace after he betrayed the devil's doctrine, and you, in his eyes, are countless times more important than his own life. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.